Hello everyone, I am Mano Scaling, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, please like the video and subscribe to the channel, and also tell me where you are from and what time you are watching. Now get comfortable and relax. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 34 years old. This happened in the remote stretch of the Flint Hills near Strong City, Kansas, where the tallgrass prairie meets isolated patches of woodland along the Cottonwood River. The smell hit me first, that putrid stench of decay mixed with something else, something wrong that made my stomach lurch and my skin crawl. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start from the beginning, when this weekend camping trip still felt like salvation instead of damnation. Our office had been a pressure cooker for months. Budget cuts, layoffs, impossible deadlines, the usual corporate nightmare that slowly grinds your soul into dust. So when Jennifer suggested we all take a long weekend to decompress in the Kansas wilderness, it seemed like exactly what we needed. Just the four of us. Me, Jennifer Lopez, our team lead and eternal optimist, Brian Wright, the office skeptic who complained about everything, and Sarah Rodriguez, the quiet one who surprised everyone by being the most outdoorsy among us. "Trust me," Jennifer had said, spreading topographical maps across the break room table. "My uncle used to hunt out there. It's completely isolated. No cell towers, no traffic, just pure nature. We'll set up camp near Mercer Creek. Maybe do some hiking through the tall grass. It'll be therapeutic." Brian had rolled his eyes. "Therapeutic? It's Kansas, Jen. What are we going to do? Stare at grass for 3 days?" But Sarah had leaned in, studying the maps with genuine interest. "Actually, this looks perfect. See this area here?" She pointed to a section marked with dense topographical lines. "There's supposed to be some old settler ruins in this valley. Could be interesting to explore." That should have been our first warning. In my experience, anything described as interesting to explore usually ends badly. We drove out Friday afternoon in 2 cars, Jennifer and Sarah in Jennifer's SUV, Brian and me following in my pickup. The last stretch of county road dissolved into a dirt track that seemed to exist more as a suggestion than an actual path. My truck bounced and lurched through ruts deep enough to swallow small animals. The October sun hung low and orange, casting everything in that eerie light that makes even familiar landscapes look foreign. "Jesus," Brian muttered, gripping the dashboard as we hit another pothole. "Are you sure we're not lost?" I checked the GPS for the 100th time, but the screen showed nothing but gray void where our location should be. Signal's been spotty since we left the highway, but Jennifer seems to know where she's going. Ahead of us, Jennifer's SUV disappeared around a bend. When we followed, I had to stop the truck and just stare. The valley opened before us like something from another world. Rolling hills covered in tallgrass prairie stretched to the horizon, broken by dark patches of woodland that looked almost black in the fading light. A thin ribbon of water, Mercer Creek, snaked through the bottom of the valley, flanked by cottonwoods whose leaves rustled with a sound like whispered secrets. "Okay," Brian admitted grudgingly. "That's actually pretty impressive." We set up camp in a clearing near the creek, maybe 50 yards from the tree line. The work went smoothly. Too smoothly in retrospect. No equipment failures, no forgotten supplies, no arguments about tent placement. Just 4 co-workers efficiently establishing our temporary home in the wilderness while the sun painted the sky in shades of blood and gold. The fire started easily, burning bright and steady as we cooked dinner. Jennifer had brought her acoustic guitar, and we spent the first hour after dark sharing stories and half-remembered songs. The darkness pressed close around our little circle of light, but it felt cozy rather than threatening. Safe. "So, what's the plan for tomorrow?" Sarah asked, poking at the fire with a stick. Sparks spiraled up into the black sky like tiny orange stars. "I vote for sleeping until noon," Brian said. "Maybe a little light hiking if the spirit moves me." "There's a trail that leads up to those settler ruins," Jennifer said. According to my uncle's notes, it's about 3 miles through the woods. Could be fun to check out some local history." "What kind of ruins?" I asked. Jennifer shrugged. "Homestead, maybe? Foundation stones, old well, the usual ghost town stuff. This whole area was settled in the 1870s, but most of the farms failed within a generation. Too isolated, too harsh." "Too haunted?" Brian suggested with a grin. "Actually," Sarah said quietly, "there are some stories about this area. Local folklore. My grandmother used to tell them." We all turned to look at her. Sarah rarely volunteered personal information, especially about her family. "What kind of stories?" Jennifer prompted. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. "Disappearances. People who went into the woods and never came out. Or came out different." "Different how?" I asked, though part of me didn't want to know. "Changed, like something else was wearing their skin." Sarah looked up at us, her face serious in the firelight. "The Shawnee had a name for this place. It translates roughly to where the hungry ghosts walk." Brian snorted. "Well, that's cheerful. Thanks for waiting until we're already here to share that little tidbit." "It's just stories," Sarah said defensively. "Folklore. Every remote place has them." But I noticed she kept glancing toward the tree line as if expecting something to emerge from the shadows. We kept the fire burning late, none of us eager to retreat to our tents. The darkness beyond our circle seemed unusually complete. Not just the absence of light, but something more active, more hungry. When I finally forced myself to look directly into the woods, I could swear I saw movement in the shadows between the trees. Nothing definite, just a sense of shapes shifting where no shapes should be. "Did you hear that?" Jennifer asked suddenly. We all stopped talking and listened. At first, there was only the normal night sounds. Wind in the grass, water over stones, the distant cry of a coyote. Then I heard it. A sound like breathing, but too deep, too slow. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, surrounding our camp like an invisible presence. "Probably just wind," Brian said, but his voice lacked conviction. The sound faded, leaving us all on edge. When we finally banked the fire and headed to our tents, I found myself moving quickly, as if something might grab me from behind if I lingered too long in the open. I shared a tent with Brian while Jennifer and Sarah had their own shelters nearby. As I lay in my sleeping bag, listening to Brian's steady breathing, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. Every rustle of fabric, every shift of the tent in the wind made me tense with anticipation. Sleep came eventually, but it was filled with dreams of vast, empty spaces and a hunger that could never be satisfied. I woke to screaming. The sound cut through my sleep like a blade, jerking me upright in my sleeping bag. Pale dawn light filtered through the tent walls, and for a moment I couldn't remember where I was. Then the scream came again. High, desperate, undeniably human. "Sarah!" Jennifer's voice, tight with panic. I scrambled out of my sleeping bag and unzipped the tent flap. Brian was right behind me, cursing under his breath. Outside, Jennifer stood near the cold remains of our fire, still in her pajamas, looking around frantically. "Where is she?" Jennifer demanded as we approached. "Sarah's gone. Her tent is empty." I looked toward Sarah's small dome tent. The zipper was open, the flap hanging loose in the morning breeze. Inside, I could see her sleeping bag, unzipped from the inside and thrown aside as if she'd left in a hurry. "Maybe she went to the bathroom," Brian suggested, but he sounded as worried as the rest of us. "In the middle of the night? Without her flashlight?" Jennifer held up Sarah's LED lantern, which had been sitting beside her tent. "And she would have told us if she was going anywhere." We called her name, our voices echoing across the valley. No response. The silence felt oppressive, unnatural. Even the birds had stopped singing. "Okay," I said, trying to sound calmer than I felt. "Let's think about this logically. She can't have gone far. Maybe she couldn't sleep and decided to take a walk." "In the dark?" Jennifer's voice cracked. "Sarah's not stupid. She knows better than to wander around unfamiliar terrain in the middle of the night. But as we searched the area around our camp, we found no sign of her. No footprints in the soft earth near the creek, no broken vegetation to suggest she'd pushed through the tall grass. It was as if she'd simply vanished. "We should call for help," Brian said, pulling out his phone. He stared at the screen and cursed. "Still no signal." "Mine's the same," Jennifer confirmed. "Dead zone." A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the cool morning air. "What about the GPS?" I checked my phone, then the handheld unit I'd brought as backup. Both showed the same thing, our location as a gray void, as if we existed in a place that officially didn't exist. "This is wrong," Brian muttered. "Technology doesn't just stop working." "Maybe it's the terrain," Jennifer suggested, "or solar flares. There are explanations." She was interrupted by a sound from the woods, branches breaking, something large moving through the underbrush. We all turned toward the tree line, hope and fear warring in our expressions. "Sarah," Jennifer called. The sounds stopped. Then, after what felt like an eternity, Sarah emerged from between the trees. Relief flooded through me so powerfully that my knees almost buckled. "Thank God. We were worried sick. Where were you?" But as Sarah walked toward us, something felt wrong. Her pace was too measured, too deliberate. Her arms hung at her sides like dead weights, and her face was completely blank, devoid of any expression. "Sarah," Jennifer stepped forward. "Are you okay?" Sarah stopped about 10 feet away and looked at us. Really looked, as if seeing us for the first time. When she smiled, it was too wide, stretching her features in a way that made my skin crawl. "I'm fine," she said, but her voice was flat, emotionless. "I was just exploring." "Exploring?" Brian's tone was sharp with disbelief. "It's barely dawn, and you left without telling anyone. We thought something had happened to you." "Nothing happened," Sarah said, still wearing that horrible smile. "I'm perfectly fine." But she wasn't fine. Everything about her was wrong. The way she stood too still, the way she blinked too little, the way she kept staring at us with those empty eyes. And there was something else, something that made my primitive brain scream warnings I couldn't quite articulate. "Sarah," I said carefully, "what were you doing in the woods?" She tilted her head, considering the question as if it were in a foreign language. "Looking," she said finally. "Looking for what?" "Food." The word hung in the air between us, loaded with implications I didn't want to examine. Jennifer laughed nervously. "Well, I hope you found some berries or something because I'm starving. Let's get breakfast started." Sarah's smile widened further, showing too many teeth. "Yes, I'm very hungry." We went through the motions of making breakfast, but the easy camaraderie of the previous night was gone. Sarah sat by herself, occasionally making comments that would have been normal if not for the complete absence of emotion in her voice. She ate mechanically, chewing each bite exactly the same number of times before swallowing. "So," Brian said, clearly struggling to maintain normalcy. "Still want to check out those ruins today?" "Oh yes," Sarah said immediately. "I'd love to see them." Something in her tone made me look up from my coffee. She was staring at Brian with an intensity that made him visibly uncomfortable. "Maybe we should head back," I suggested. "We could always come back another time when—" "When what?" Sarah interrupted, her head snapping toward me with unnatural speed. "When you're not afraid?" "I'm not afraid," I lied. "I just think—" "You are afraid," Sarah said matter-of-factly. "I can smell it on you. Fear has a very distinctive scent." Jennifer set down her coffee cup with shaking hands. "Sarah, you're scaring us. What's wrong with you?" For a moment, Sarah's expression flickered as if something was struggling beneath the surface. When she spoke again, her voice was different, strained, desperate. "Run," she whispered. "Please, I can still run." Then her face went blank again, and when she smiled, I saw that her teeth were stained with something dark. "I think we should go hiking," she said pleasantly. "The woods are lovely this time of year." Brian was already on his feet, backing toward his tent. "Fuck this. I'm packing up. We're leaving. Now." "No." The word came out of Sarah's mouth like a growl. "You're not leaving." She stood up with fluid grace, and I realized she was holding a knife, the hunting knife from our camp supplies. When had she picked that up? "Sarah, put the knife down," Jennifer said, her voice carefully controlled. "You're not yourself. Something's wrong, and we need to get you help." "Help?" Sarah laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "You want to help me? Then come closer. Let me show you what I found in the woods." She took a step toward Jennifer, the knife catching the morning light. Brian grabbed a camp chair, holding it like a shield. "Stay back," he shouted. "I don't know what's wrong with you, but—" Sarah moved faster than should have been possible. One moment she was 10 feet away. The next, she was on Brian, the knife sliding between his ribs with a wet sound that I'll hear until the day I die. Brian's eyes went wide with shock and pain, and he tried to say something, but only blood came out of his mouth. Jennifer screamed. I stumbled backward, my mind refusing to process what I was seeing. And this couldn't be happening. This couldn't be real. Sarah, or the thing wearing Sarah's face, pulled the knife free and turned toward us. Brian collapsed, clutching his chest, dark blood pooling beneath him. "You should have run when I told you to," she said sadly. "Now it's too late." I grabbed Jennifer's hand and pulled her toward my truck. Behind us, I could hear that terrible breathing sound again, much louder now, as if something massive was drawing air into its lungs. When I risked a glance over my shoulder, I saw Sarah standing over Brian's body, but her shadow on the ground was wrong. Too tall, too angular, with what looked like antlers spreading from its head. We reached the truck, and I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get them in the ignition. The engine turned over just as something slammed into the passenger side window. Jennifer shrieked as spiderweb cracks spread across the glass. Through the fractured window, I saw Sarah's face, but her eyes were completely black now, and when she opened her mouth, I glimpsed rows of jagged teeth that definitely didn't belong to my coworker. "Let us in," she said in a voice like grinding stone. "We're so very hungry." I floored the gas pedal and the truck lurched forward. Sarah fell away from the window, but as we bounced and skidded up the dirt track, I could see her in the rearview mirror, standing perfectly still and watching us go. She wasn't alone. Shapes moved in the tree line behind her, too tall and thin to be human. "What the hell was that?" Jennifer sobbed. "What happened to her?" "I don't know," I said, fighting to keep control as we hit a particularly vicious pothole. "But we need to get out of here and find help." The dirt track seemed longer than it had on the way in, winding through landscape that looked subtly different in the harsh morning light. The grass seemed taller, more aggressive, reaching toward the truck like grasping fingers. And the trees. The trees were definitely wrong. They leaned inward over the path, creating a tunnel of shadow that shouldn't have existed in broad daylight. "Michael," Jennifer said quietly, "are you sure this is the right way?" I checked the GPS again, but it was still showing nothing. Worse, the fuel gauge was reading nearly empty, which was impossible. I'd filled up before we left town. "The truck's acting up," I said, trying to keep the panic out of my voice. "But this has to be the right direction. It's the only road." "What if it's not?" Jennifer's voice was small, defeated. "What if we're lost? What if we can't get out?" I didn't have an answer for that. The track ahead curved sharply to the left, disappearing into a stand of gnarled oaks that I didn't remember from our trip in. But there was nowhere else to go, so I followed the path as it led us deeper into a landscape that grew stranger and more hostile with each passing mile. The sun, which should have been climbing higher, seemed stuck in the same position, casting the same long shadows hour after hour. My watch had stopped working, the hands frozen at 8:47. When I tried to restart it, the digital display just showed a string of zeros. "Time's broken," I said, mostly to myself. "What?" "Nothing." I didn't want to worry Jennifer more than she already was. But something was very wrong with this place. Something that went beyond Sarah's transformation or our navigation problems. It was as if we'd driven into a pocket of reality where the normal rules didn't apply. We'd been driving for what felt like hours when Jennifer suddenly pointed ahead. Look. Through the trees, I could see buildings. Old, weathered structures that looked like they'd been abandoned for decades. This had to be the settler ruins Sarah had mentioned. "Should we stop?" Jennifer asked. Every instinct I had screamed against it, but the truck was running on fumes, and I didn't know how much farther we could go. "Maybe there's something there we can use, a way to call for help." I pulled into what had once been a clearing but was now mostly reclaimed by the prairie. The ruins were more extensive than I'd expected. The remains of at least 6 buildings arranged around what had probably been the main street of a small settlement. Most were just foundation stones and collapsed walls, but one structure near the center of the town remained partially intact. "Cavendish," Jennifer read from a weathered sign half hidden by weeds. "Population. I can't make out the number." We approached the intact building cautiously. It had been a general store, judging by the faded advertisements still visible on its walls. The front door hung open on rusted hinges, creaking in the constant wind. "Hello," I called. "Anyone there?" My voice echoed strangely, as if the sound was being absorbed and twisted by the empty spaces. No one answered. Inside, the store was a tomb of broken shelves and scattered debris. Sunlight filtered through holes in the roof, creating pools of brightness that only made the shadows seem deeper. In the back corner, I found an old radio, its tubes dark and cracked. "Anything?" Jennifer asked from near the front windows. "Nothing that works." I was about to give up when I noticed something scratched into the wooden counter. Words, carved deep into the wood with what looked like a knife point. They came in winter. They were so hungry. God help us. They ate everyone. Below that, in a different hand, the Wendigo walks. Do not trust the faces of the dead. "Jennifer," I called. "You need to see this." But when I turned around, the store was empty. Jennifer was gone. "Jennifer!" I ran outside, looking frantically in all directions. The clearing was empty except for my truck and the skeletal remains of the settlement. "Jennifer!" My voice echoed across the prairie, but there was no response. I checked the truck, hoping she'd gone back there, but it was empty too. The keys were still in the ignition and the fuel gauge now read completely empty. I was alone. That's when I heard the humming. It was coming from one of the ruined buildings, a melodic sound that was almost familiar. I followed it to what had once been a house, now just a foundation and one standing wall. Jennifer sat in the middle of the ruins, her back to me, humming a tune I couldn't quite place. Jennifer. Thank God, I thought. She stopped humming and turned around. The face that looked at me was Jennifer's, but wrong in all the subtle ways that Sarah had been wrong. Too still, too perfect, too empty. "Hello, Michael," she said with that same flat affect. "I was waiting for you." "Where did you go?" I asked, backing away slowly. "What happened?" "I went to meet our friends," Jennifer said, standing with the same fluid grace I'd seen in Sarah. "They've been so lonely, so hungry." "Friends?" Other figures emerged from the ruins around me. At first glance, they looked human. Men and women in clothing from different eras, some wearing the simple garb of 19th century settlers, others in more modern dress. But their movements were wrong, too coordinated, like marionettes controlled by the same puppeteer. And their eyes. Their eyes were all black, empty holes that reflected no light. "The people of Cavendish," Jennifer explained helpfully. "They've been waiting here for so long, trapped between hunger and death, but now they have you." "What do you want?" I asked, though I was afraid I already knew. "To feed," said a voice behind me. I turned to see Sarah emerging from behind another ruin, still wearing that horrible smile. To finally finally feed. They began closing in, moving with that same unnatural coordination. I looked around desperately for an escape route, but they had me surrounded. The only way out was through them, and I didn't like my chances. That's when I remembered the hunting knife in my backpack. Brian's blood was still on it. I'd grabbed it when we fled the campsite, though I couldn't remember why. My hands shook as I pulled it out, the metal gleaming in the strange, unchanging light. "Stay back!" I shouted, waving the knife in front of me. The things that looked like Jennifer and Sarah exchanged glances, then began laughing. It was a sound like wind through dead leaves, completely devoid of humor. "Iron," Sarah said with amusement. "How quaint." "Cold iron," corrected Jennifer. "Forged in fire, blessed by purpose. Yes, that might actually hurt us." They stopped advancing, suddenly wary. I didn't understand what they were talking about, but if they were afraid of the knife, that was all I needed to know. "That's right," I said, trying to project more confidence than I felt. "So back off, or I'll show you exactly how much it hurts." For a moment, we faced each other in tense silence. Then Sarah's form began to change, her skin darkening and stretching, her limbs elongating into something insectoid and terrible. When she opened her mouth, I saw rows of needle-sharp teeth designed for tearing flesh from bone. "We are so very hungry," she said in a voice like grinding gravel, "and you smell so very good." She lunged at me, moving faster than anything human should be able to move. I swung the knife in a wild arc, more lucky than skillful, and felt it connect with something solid. Sarah screamed, a sound like metal tearing, and staggered backward, black ichor streaming from a gash across her transformed face. The others hesitated, which gave me the opening I needed. I ran. The settlement was a maze of ruins and debris, but I knew my general direction, back toward where I'd left the truck. Behind me, I could hear them giving chase, their feet making no sound on the ground but their breathing growing closer with each step. I reached the truck and dove inside, slamming the door and hitting the lock. The engine was dead, but maybe I could. Something crashed into the driver's side window, spiderwebbing the glass. Through the cracks, I saw Jennifer's face, but her features were shifting and melting like wax in a fire. When she spoke, her voice came from everywhere at once. "You can't run forever," she said. "This place is ours now. Time doesn't work here. Distance doesn't work here. There is only hunger, and the feeding, and the long wait between meals." I stabbed the knife through the broken window and she jerked back with another inhuman shriek. The blade came back coated with something that looked like tar mixed with blood. "Iron," I muttered. "Cold iron." I'd heard that phrase before in old stories my grandmother used to tell. Iron was supposed to repel certain kinds of supernatural creatures. I didn't know if these things were supernatural or just insane, but the knife was working, and that was all that mattered. I forced open the truck door and ran again, this time heading for the tree line. If I could make it to the woods, maybe I could lose them in the undergrowth. The knife felt warm in my hand, almost alive, as if it were eager to taste more of their alien blood. The forest was dark and twisted, full of shadows that moved independently of their sources. I could hear them behind me, crashing through the underbrush with increasing desperation. They were hurting me, I realized, driving me deeper into the woods where escape would be impossible. But I had a plan now. A desperate, probably suicidal plan, but better than just running until I collapsed. I found what I was looking for in a small clearing. A circle of standing stones, weathered and ancient, covered in symbols that hurt to look at directly. This had to be the heart of whatever was wrong with this place, the source of the wrongness that had infected Sarah and Jennifer, and God knows how many others over the years. The pursuing footsteps stopped at the edge of the clearing. I turned to see them standing in the tree line, Sarah, Jennifer, and maybe a dozen others, all wearing human faces but moving with the coordinated purpose of a hive mind. "You cannot destroy us," Sarah said. "We are eternal. We are hunger incarnate." "Maybe," I admitted, "but I can sure as hell try." I walked to the center of the stone circle and raised the knife above my head. "Iron forged in fire," I said, remembering Jennifer's words. "Blessed by purpose." The knife began to glow, actual light emanating from the blade as if it were red hot. The creatures at the forest edge hissed and drew back, shielding their faces from the radiance. "Blessed by purpose," I repeated, and brought the knife down on the central stone. The impact sent shockwaves through the ground. Cracks appeared in the ancient stone, spreading outward like a spider web. The creature's hissing rose to a scream that seemed to come from the earth itself. I raised the knife again and struck a second time. More cracks, deeper now, and the screaming intensified. Around the clearing, trees began to wither and collapse as if whatever force had been sustaining this pocket of wrongness was failing. The third strike shattered the stone completely. The world exploded in light and sound and chaos. I was thrown backward, the knife flying from my hand as reality reasserted itself with violent force. When the brightness faded and my vision cleared, I was lying in an ordinary forest clearing, surrounded by ordinary trees under an ordinary blue sky. My phone was buzzing. I pulled it out and saw full signal strength, 17 missed calls, and a timestamp that showed it was Sunday afternoon, exactly when it should be if we'd been camping for 2 days. I staggered to my feet and looked around. The stone circle was gone, replaced by a small campfire ring made of ordinary rocks. The creatures were gone too, leaving only the normal sounds of wind and birds and running water somewhere nearby. But I wasn't alone. Sarah sat with her back against a tree, very much alive and very much herself. She looked up as I approached, her eyes filled with confusion and fear. "Michael," she said weakly, "what happened? I remember going to gather firewood, and then nothing. Where are the others?" I looked around the clearing, but there was no sign of Jennifer or Brian. "I don't know," I said honestly. "What's the last thing you remember?" "Friday night, sitting around the fire listening to Jennifer play guitar." Sarah struggled to stand, and I helped her up. "You look terrible. How long have I been unconscious?" I checked my phone again. According to the GPS, we were exactly where we were supposed to be, in the Tallgrass Prairie National Preserve, about a mile from our original campsite. But Jennifer and Brian were gone, and I had no way to explain what had happened without sounding completely insane. "We need to get out of here," I said finally. "Can you walk?" She nodded, though she still looked shaky. We made our way through the woods, following the GPS coordinates back toward the main trail. It took about an hour, but we eventually reached the parking area where all 4 cars sat waiting, including Jennifer's SUV and Brian's sedan. "Their cars are here," Sarah said, stating the obvious. "So where are they?" I didn't have an answer. We waited until dark, calling their names and searching the immediate area, but found no trace of our missing co-workers. Finally, I convinced Sarah that we needed to contact the authorities. The park rangers took our report seriously, launching a full search and rescue operation that lasted 3 days. They found our abandoned campsite, complete with Brian's blood soaked into the ground near the fire ring, but no other evidence of what had happened. The official report listed Jennifer Lopez and Brian Wright as missing persons, presumed lost in the wilderness. They never found the settlement called Cavendish. According to the county records, no such place had ever existed in that area of Kansas. When I described the location to the search teams, they found only empty prairie and scattered stones that could have been natural rock formations. The hunting knife was gone too. I'd looked for it in the clearing where I'd destroyed the stone circle, but it had vanished along with everything else that might have served as proof of our ordeal. Sarah recovered physically, but she had no memory of the 3 days we'd been missing. The doctors called it dissociative amnesia brought on by trauma, which was as good an explanation as any. She quit her job 2 weeks later and moved to Colorado, saying she needed a fresh start. I stayed in Kansas, partly out of stubbornness and partly because someone needed to keep looking for answers. I've spent months researching the history of that area, digging through old newspapers and county records and Native American oral traditions. What I've found confirms my worst fears. The disappearances go back over a century. Groups of travelers, hunting parties, survey teams. People who went into the Flint Hills and either never came out or came out wrong. The patterns are always the same. Witnesses report strange behavior in the missing persons, technology failures, time distortions, and encounters with creatures that wear human faces but hunger for human flesh. The Shawnee name Sarah mentioned translates more accurately as where the Wendigo waits. The Wendigo, a creature of endless hunger that can take any shape, influence technology, and bend reality to its will. According to the stories, they can only be stopped by iron, forged in fire and blessed by righteous purpose. But here's the thing that keeps me awake at night. I've been back to that area 6 times in the past year, always armed with iron implements, always prepared for another encounter. The stone circle is always there when I arrive, intact and humming with malevolent energy. And I always destroy it, always watch reality reassert itself in a burst of light and chaos. But the stones are always whole again the next time I return. Time doesn't work right in that place. Distance doesn't work right. Maybe the Wendigo isn't trapped there. Maybe it exists in multiple timelines simultaneously, feeding on travelers across decades or centuries of parallel realities. Maybe every time I destroy those stones, I'm only closing one door while countless others remain open. Sometimes late at night, my phone rings. When I answer, I hear Jennifer's voice or Brian's voice, always saying the same thing. "We're so hungry, Michael. Why won't you come back and feed us?" I've changed my number 4 times, but they always find me. And sometimes, when I'm driving through unfamiliar areas or hiking in remote locations, I'll see them in my peripheral vision. Jennifer and Brian and a dozen others, always just out of direct sight, always following, always hungry. I keep iron knives in my car, my house, my office. Cold iron, forged in fire, blessed by purpose. It's the only thing that seems to keep them at bay. But I know they're still out there, in that pocket of wrongness where time stands still and hunger never dies, waiting for the next group of unsuspecting campers to stumble into their web. Sarah calls me sometimes from her new life in Colorado. She still doesn't remember what happened to us in those missing 3 days, and I've never told her the truth. What would be the point? She's safe now, far from the twisted prairie where the Wendigo walks. But last week she mentioned that she was planning a camping trip in the Colorado Rockies with some new friends from work. I told her not to go. I told her to trust her instincts if anything felt wrong. I told her to carry iron. She laughed and said I was being paranoid, that whatever happened in Kansas was just a fluke, that she was ready to get back to normal outdoor activities. I didn't tell her that some hungers follow you wherever you go. I didn't tell her that some doors, once opened, can never be fully closed. I didn't tell her that sometimes, late at night, I still wake up with the taste of decay in my mouth and the sound of that terrible breathing echoing in my ears. Because some truths are too heavy for anyone to carry, and some stories are better left untold. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 32 years old. This happened in the remote Flint Hills region of Kansas, near Council Grove, in late October of last year. I should have known something was wrong when Robert suggested we camp at Alagauho Heritage Memorial Park instead of our usual spot at Tuttle Creek. Robert Johnson had been my best friend since college, and in all the years I'd known him, he'd never been one for spontaneous changes to our plans. He was methodical, careful, the kind of guy who packed emergency supplies for a weekend trip to the grocery store. But that Thursday afternoon he called me at work with an edge to his voice I'd never heard before. "Michael, we need to change locations for this weekend," he said without preamble. "I found this place online, Alagawaho. It's perfect, remote, historic, real wilderness." I remember shifting the phone against my ear, squinting at the quarterly reports spread across my desk at the insurance office. "Rob, we've had the Tuttle Creek reservation for months. What's wrong with—" "Nothing's wrong." He cut me off, but his voice had that tight quality it got when he was lying. I had a dream about this place, about us being there. It felt important." That should have been my first red flag. Robert didn't believe in dreams or intuition or anything that couldn't be quantified and measured. He was an engineer, for Christ's sake. But I was dealing with the anniversary of my sister Emma's death, and the idea of getting lost in the wilderness for a few days sounded better than sitting in my apartment, staring at old photographs and wondering if I could have saved her from that drunk driver. "Fine," I said, "but you're handling all the arrangements." The drive from Wichita to Council Grove took us through increasingly sparse farmland until we reached the Flint Hills proper, an endless sea of tall prairie grass that shifted and flowed like water in the October wind. The sky seemed bigger here, more oppressive, pressing down on the earth with the weight of gathering storm clouds. Robert had printed out directions to a remote camping area within the Memorial Park boundaries, accessed by a dirt road that branched off from Highway 177. As we turned onto the track, I noticed his hands were gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary. "You okay?" I asked. He glanced at me, and for a moment I saw something in his eyes that looked almost like fear. But then he smiled, that easy grin that had gotten us both out of trouble countless times in college, and shook his head. Just excited to get away from civilization for a while. The road wound deeper into the preserve, past informational signs about the area's significance to the Kansa people and the importance of preserving the tallgrass prairie ecosystem. The farther we drove, the more isolated we became. Cell phone coverage disappeared entirely about 5 miles in, and even Robert's GPS began showing that spinning wheel of confusion. "That's weird," he muttered, tapping the screen. "It was working fine this morning." By the time we reached our intended campsite, a small clearing beside an unnamed creek that meandered through the grassland, the sun was already beginning its descent toward the horizon. The spot was perfect, sheltered by a copse of cottonwoods and bur oaks with fresh water and plenty of space for our tents. It was also completely isolated. I couldn't see another human soul in any direction, just endless rolling hills of grass that stretched to the darkening sky. We set up camp efficiently, the practiced routine of 2 men who'd been doing this together for over a decade. Robert's tent went up first, a military surplus number in olive drab that looked like it could withstand a hurricane. Mine was more modest, a bright orange dome that clashed violently with the muted colors of the prairie. As we worked, I became aware of the sound. At first, I thought it was just the wind moving through the grass, but as darkness fell and the wind died down, the sound remained. A low, constant whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It reminded me of voices, but too distant and distorted to make out words. "Do you hear that?" I asked Robert as we sat around our small campfire, eating canned chili and stale bread. He paused, spoon halfway to his mouth, and listened. The whispering swelled slightly, as if responding to my attention. "Hear what?" "That sound. Like voices." Robert's expression went carefully blank. "It's just the wind and the grass, Mike. Prairie nights can play tricks on you." But I knew the difference between wind and voices, and this was definitely voices. Faint, yes, and in a language I didn't recognize, but unmistakably human. The sound made my skin crawl, raising goosebumps along my arms despite the warmth from the fire. "Maybe," I said, not wanting to push it. Robert had been acting strange enough already. We spent the rest of the evening talking about work, about the upcoming hunting season, about anything except the growing sense of wrongness that seemed to settle over our campsite like a fog. The fire burned normally enough, casting dancing shadows on the trees around us, but I couldn't shake the feeling that those shadows were moving independently, shifting and writhing in ways that had nothing to do with the flames. When we finally turned in around 10 o'clock, I lay in my sleeping bag for what felt like hours, listening to that constant whisper from the grass. At some point, exhaustion finally overcame unease, and I drifted off into uneasy dreams filled with vast prairies and something dark hunting me through the endless grass. I woke to silence. Complete, absolute silence. No whispers, no wind, no night sounds at all. Even my own breathing seemed muffled, as if the air itself had thickened around our campsite. I checked my watch, 2:47 a.m., and immediately knew something was wrong. October nights in Kansas were never this quiet. There should have been owls, coyotes, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. Instead, there was nothing. I unzipped my tent flap and peered out. The fire had died down to glowing embers, casting just enough light to see Robert's tent across the clearing. It looked normal enough, but something about its shape bothered me. After a moment, I realized what it was. The tent was too still. No rise and fall of breathing, no small movements of someone sleeping restlessly. "Rob?" I called softly. No answer. I crawled out of my tent and padded barefoot across the cold ground to his tent. The zipper was partially open, which was strange. Robert was obsessive about sealing his tent completely before sleeping. I pulled the flap wider and shined my phone's flashlight inside. Empty. Not just empty. The sleeping bag was unzipped from the inside, pulled back as if he'd gotten out voluntarily. His clothes were still there, neatly folded in the corner. His boots sat by the tent entrance. Whatever had happened, Robert had left camp in his underwear and bare feet. The silence pressed in around me as I stood there, trying to make sense of it. People didn't just vanish from their tents in the middle of nowhere. There had to be an explanation. Maybe he'd gotten up to relieve himself and gotten lost in the dark. Maybe he'd heard something and gone to investigate. But even as I told myself these reasonable explanations, my hands were shaking as I pulled on my boots and jacket. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to pack up immediately and get out of there, but I couldn't leave without Robert. We'd been friends too long, been through too much together. I spent the next hour searching the immediate area around our campsite, calling his name in increasingly loud whispers. I didn't want to shout. Some primitive part of my brain was convinced that loud noises would attract something I didn't want to meet. The beam of my flashlight revealed nothing but endless grass and the occasional startled eyes of small animals. By 4 a.m., I was genuinely panicking. I tried my cell phone, hoping for even a single bar of signal, but got nothing. The GPS was still spinning uselessly. Even my compass seemed confused, the needle wavering between magnetic north and some other direction entirely. That's when I heard the whispers again. They started faint, just at the edge of perception, but quickly grew louder and more distinct. Now I could make out individual voices, though they were speaking in a language that hurt my ears to hear, all clicking consonants and vowel sounds that seemed to come from deep in the throat. The voices were coming from the south, deeper into the preserve, away from the road. Against every rational thought in my head, I started walking toward them. The prairie at night was a different world entirely. The grass, which had looked golden and beautiful in the daylight, now seemed to lean in around me, creating tunnels and passages that hadn't been there before. My flashlight beam barely penetrated the darkness, creating a small bubble of yellow light that made the surrounding blackness seem even more impenetrable. The voices grew stronger as I walked, and gradually I began to pick out one that was different from the others. Familiar. It was Robert's voice, but wrong somehow. Too flat, too monotone, like someone doing a poor impression of my friend. "Michael," it called from somewhere ahead of me. "Michael, come here. I found something." I stopped walking, every hair on my body standing on end. The voice was definitely Robert's, but it was off. The cadence was wrong, the inflection strange. It reminded me of the way Emma had sounded in the hospital after the accident, when the brain damage had left her able to speak but unable to inject any real emotion into her words. "Rob," I called back. "Where are you?" "Here," came the reply, but it seemed to come from 3 different directions at once. "I'm here. Come to me." I took another step forward, then another, following the sound of his voice deeper into the grassland. The whispers continued around me, but now they seemed to be commenting on my progress, discussing me in that harsh, clicking language. Several times I thought I heard laughter. After what felt like miles but was probably only a few hundred yards, I emerged into another clearing, this one dominated by a large limestone boulder that rose from the prairie like a broken tooth. Robert stood beside it, his back to me, still wearing only his underwear despite the October chill. "Rob," I called, relief flooding through me. "Jesus, man, you scared the hell out of me. What are you doing out here?" He turned around slowly, too slowly, like a marionette being manipulated by an inexperienced puppeteer. When I saw his face in the flashlight beam, my blood turned to ice water. It was Robert's face, but it was wrong in ways that my brain struggled to process. His features were all there. The same brown eyes, the same slightly crooked nose he'd broken playing football in high school, the same smile lines around his mouth. But they were arranged incorrectly, as if someone had taken a photograph of his face and reassembled it with the pieces slightly out of place. His eyes were too far apart, his mouth too wide, his nose positioned just a fraction of an inch too high. "I found it," he said in that flat, emotionless voice. "I found what was calling to me." "Rob, what are you talking about? You're scaring me, man." He tilted his head to one side, the movement sharp and bird-like. "You don't understand yet, but you will. It's beautiful, Michael. It wants to show you things. It wants to show you Emma." The mention of my sister's name hit me like a physical blow. I'd never told Robert the details of her death, never explained how the drunk driver had left her brain damaged and suffering for 3 weeks before she finally died. How I'd been the one to make the decision to take her off life support. How I still woke up some nights hearing her calling my name in that same flat, emotionless voice. "How do you know about Emma?" I whispered. Robert, who wasn't. Robert smiled, and I saw that his teeth were wrong too. Too sharp, too numerous, arranged in rows like a shark's. "It knows everything. It's been waiting for you, Michael. Waiting for so long." The limestone boulder behind him began to change, or maybe my perception of it changed. What I had taken for natural stone formations now looked suspiciously like carved symbols, spirals and angular shapes that seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and I realized they were coming from the rock itself. "What is that thing?" I asked, taking a step backward. "A doorway," Robert said, his voice now overlaid with harmonics that definitely didn't come from human vocal cords. "A place where the barriers are thin. Your people built their monuments here because they understood. The Kansa knew to stay away." The wrongness of the situation crashed over me all at once. This wasn't Robert. This was something else. Something that had taken his shape and was wearing it like an ill-fitting mask. The real Robert was gone, probably dead, and I was alone in the middle of nowhere with a creature that knew my deepest guilt and was using it against me. I turned and ran. Behind me, the thing that looked like Robert laughed, a sound like breaking glass mixed with radio static. The laughter followed me as I crashed through the tall grass, branches and thorns tearing at my clothes. My flashlight beam bounced wildly, creating a strobe effect that turned the prairie into a nightmare landscape of shifting shadows and grasping vegetation. The whispers were everywhere now, coming from the grass itself, from the sky, from inside my own head. They spoke of Emma, of the accident, of the choice I'd made in that sterile hospital room. They knew everything, every detail I'd tried to forget, every moment of guilt I'd buried under years of work and routine and careful numbness. "You let her die," they whispered. "You pulled the plug. You killed your own sister." I stumbled and fell, rolling down a small embankment into a creek bed that definitely hadn't been there on our way to the campsite. The water was ice cold and tasted of copper and decay. When I pulled myself to my feet, spitting mud and blood, I realized I had no idea which direction I'd come from. The prairie stretched out around me in all directions, an endless sea of grass under a starless sky. My flashlight flickered and died, leaving me in complete darkness. The whispers continued, but now they were joined by other sounds. Footsteps in the grass, getting closer, and that horrible laughter that wasn't quite Robert's. "Michael," called that wrong voice, "don't run from me. I want to show you something wonderful." I forced myself to stay still, to listen beyond the whispers and my own labored breathing. Somewhere in the distance, I could hear the faint sound of running water, the creek we'd camped beside. If I could find it, I could follow it back to our campsite, get to the truck, and get the hell out of there. Moving as quietly as possible, I began working my way toward the sound of water. The grass was thick and tangled, full of thorns and hidden holes that sent me stumbling every few steps. Several times I thought I heard Robert calling my name from different directions, but I ignored the sound and kept moving. It took me nearly an hour to find the creek, and when I did, I realized with growing horror that it was flowing in the wrong direction. When we'd set up camp, the water had been flowing east toward the Kansas River. Now it was flowing west, back toward the interior of the preserve. Time was wrong here. Direction was wrong. The very landscape was shifting around me like a living thing, rearranging itself to keep me trapped. I followed the creek anyway, because it was the only landmark I had. The water babbled and chuckled as it flowed over the rocks, and I could swear I heard words in the sound. Emma's voice, calling my name, asking why I'd let her go. The whispers never stopped. When I finally reached what should have been our campsite, I found something that made my knees buckle. The clearing was there, and so were our tents, but everything was wrong. The orange dome of my tent had turned gray and was covered in some kind of fungal growth that pulsed rhythmically in the darkness. Robert's military tent had collapsed in on itself, and through the rips in the fabric I could see something moving inside, something too large to be human. The remains of our campfire were still glowing, but the flames were blue-white and gave off no heat. They illuminated a scene that belonged in a fever dream. Our gear was scattered everywhere, but it was all wrong. Our backpacks had melted into organic shapes that breathed like living things. Our sleeping bags had split open like cocoons, revealing something wet and glistening inside. And everywhere, carved into the trees, scratched into the ground, etched into the very rocks, were those same spiral symbols I'd seen on the limestone boulder. "Beautiful, isn't it?" said Robert's voice from behind me. I spun around to find him standing at the edge of the clearing, but he was even more wrong than before. His proportions had shifted, his limbs too long, his neck stretched like taffy. His face was a crude approximation of human features painted onto something that had never been human at all. "This is what you wanted," it continued in that flat mockery of my friend's voice. "To forget. To stop carrying the guilt. I can do that for you, Michael. I can make it all go away." "What are you?" I managed to whisper. "I am what your people called Skinwalker, though that name doesn't capture what I truly am. I am the hunger between moments, the shadow behind memory. I am very old, and I have been very patient." It took a step toward me, and I saw that its feet weren't quite touching the ground. "Your friend fought me at first, but he's so much happier now, sleeping in the warm dark. Would you like to see him?" The thing that had been Robert reached behind its back and pulled something forward. A human head, recognizably Robert's but with the eyes removed and the mouth sewn shut with what looked like grass. The head was still alive, still aware, the remaining features twisted in an expression of absolute terror. I ran again. This time, I didn't try to be quiet or careful. I crashed through the undergrowth like a wounded animal, branches tearing at my face and clothes. Behind me, I could hear the Skinwalker laughing, but it wasn't pursuing me. At least, not quickly. It was taking its time, confident that I had nowhere to go. The truck. If I could reach the truck, I might have a chance. The keys were in Robert's pocket, but maybe I could hotwire it or break a window, and I reached the dirt road where we'd left the vehicle and stopped dead. The truck was there, but it was wrong, like everything else in this place. It had sunk into the earth up to its axles, and the metal was corroded as if it had been sitting there for decades. Vines and prairie grass had grown up through the engine compartment, and when I peered through the windshield, I saw that the interior was full of water, dark, stagnant water that moved with its own current. Floating in that water, face down, was what remained of the real Robert Johnson. I think I screamed then. I'm not sure. The next thing I remember clearly was running down the dirt road, following the tire tracks back toward the highway. The whispers followed me, growing louder and more insistent with each step. They spoke of guilt and shame and the relief of giving in, of letting something else carry the burden of consciousness. The road seemed to stretch endlessly ahead of me, far longer than it had been on the drive in. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I kept running because stopping meant giving in, meant joining Robert in whatever horrible existence the skinwalker had prepared for him. Dawn was breaking when I finally saw the highway ahead, real asphalt, real lane markers, the blessed sight of another human being in the form of a farmer driving his tractor to the fields. I flagged him down, babbling about my friend, about getting lost, about needing help. He called the sheriff and a search party was organized. But when they went back to look for Robert, they found nothing. No campsite, no disturbed ground, no sign that anyone had ever been in that part of the preserve. The dirt road was there, but it led to an empty meadow with no trace of human activity. They found Robert's truck 3 days later at the bottom of Council Grove Reservoir, as if it had been there for months. The official report said he'd suffered some kind of psychotic break, driven the vehicle into the water, and then disappeared into the wilderness. They're still looking for his body. I know they'll never find it. I tried to go back once, 2 weeks later, in broad daylight with a GPS unit and a satellite phone. I followed Highway 177 to the exact turnoff I remembered, but there was no dirt road, just prairie grass stretching away into the distance, unmarked and undisturbed. But sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind is still, I can hear the whispers. They're fainter now, filtered through distance and time, but they're still there, still calling my name, still promising to take away the guilt, the pain, the weight of memory, still promising to show me Emma. The thing is, I remember more now than I did before, about that night in the hospital, about the choice I made. Emma wasn't brain dead like I'd been telling myself all these years. She was aware, trapped in a body that couldn't heal but still conscious, still suffering. And when I made the decision to end her life support, she looked at me with those brown eyes, Robert's eyes, and whispered my name one last time. She forgave me, I think. At least, I hope she did. But the skinwalker in the Flint Hills knows the truth. It knows that I didn't pull the plug to end her suffering. I did it to end mine. To stop having to see her lying there, broken and changed, a daily reminder of my failure to protect her. And someday, when the guilt becomes too much to bear, when the whispers grow too loud to ignore, I know I'll go back to that place. I'll find that dirt road that exists only when it wants to be found, and I'll walk into the tall grass where something ancient and hungry is waiting for me. Maybe then I'll see Emma again. Maybe then I'll understand what Robert found so beautiful about the warm dark. But not today. Today, I'm still fighting, still running, still trying to convince myself that the dreams where Emma visits me aren't real, that the growing shadows in my peripheral vision are just fatigue, that the way my reflection sometimes moves a fraction of a second too late is just my imagination. Today, I'm still human. Tomorrow might be different. The whispers are getting louder. My name is Kenneth Young, and I am 32 years old. This happened in the remote wilderness near the Cimarron National Grassland in southwestern Kansas, where the endless prairie gives way to sandstone bluffs and hidden canyons that most people never see. Brian Wright and I had been friends since college, bonded by our shared love of the outdoors and our mutual desire to escape the suffocating corporate world of Wichita every chance we got. We'd been planning this particular trip for months, a long weekend camping in the backcountry near the Middle Spring, far from any marked trails or designated campsites. Brian had found the location on an old geological survey map, a pristine area where Bluff Creek carved through the prairie, creating a hidden oasis of cottonwoods and sandhills. "It'll be like the old frontier days," Brian had said, his eyes lighting up with that infectious enthusiasm that made him such a good sales manager. "Just us, the wilderness, and whatever we can carry on our backs." I should have paid more attention to the locals' reactions when we stopped for supplies in Liberal. The elderly man at the sporting goods store had grown quiet when Brian mentioned our destination, his weathered hands pausing as he rang up our last-minute purchases. "Bluff Creek area, you said?" The man's voice carried a weight I didn't understand then. Might want to stick closer to the main recreation areas. That country's got a way of changing folks. Brian had laughed it off, making jokes about Kansas rednecks and their superstitions. I'd joined in, but something in the old man's eyes had lodged itself in my mind like a splinter. The drive to our jumping-off point took us down increasingly narrow county roads until we were bouncing along barely maintained tracks that carved through the short grass prairie. The landscape here was different from the eastern Kansas most people knew. Older, more primal, with weathered mesas rising from the grassland like sleeping giants and strange rock formations that looked almost deliberate in their arrangement. We parked Brian's truck at the end of a dirt road beside a rusted cattle guard, shouldered our packs, and struck out across the prairie toward the creek bottom. The autumn air was crisp, carrying the scent of cured grass and distant wood smoke. Above us, the sky stretched endless and blue, so vast it made me dizzy to look at it directly. "God, I love this place," Brian said, adjusting his pack straps. "Look at all that space. Makes you feel like you could walk forever and never see another human being." He was right. The isolation was intoxicating after months of cubicles and conference calls. But as we hiked deeper into the wilderness, I began to notice things that didn't quite fit the pristine frontier image Brian had painted. The first was the silence. The prairie should have been alive with the sounds of insects and birds, but the farther we walked, the quieter it became. Even our own footsteps seemed muffled, as if the very air was absorbing sound. The second was the absence of wildlife. We'd been hiking for 3 hours and hadn't seen so much as a meadowlark or a grasshopper. The prairie stretched empty in every direction, beautiful but eerily lifeless. "Notice how quiet it is?" I asked Brian as we stopped to check our GPS. He was frowning at the device, turning it in different directions. "Yeah, weird. And this thing keeps losing signal. Shows us in 3 different locations depending on how I hold it." I pulled out my phone. No signal, which wasn't unusual this far from civilization, but the battery was draining faster than it should have been. It had been at full charge when we left the truck 2 hours ago, and now it showed only 60%. "My phone's acting up too," I said, but Brian was already walking again, following what looked like a game trail toward a distant line of trees that marked the creek. We made camp in a grove of ancient cottonwoods near the water, their leaves already turning gold with the approaching winter. The spot was perfect: level ground, fresh water, and shelter from the constant prairie wind. But as the sun began to set, I found myself increasingly uneasy. The darkness here was absolute in a way I'd never experienced. Even in remote areas, there's usually some ambient light, distant cities, farms, the glow of civilization on the horizon. But here, it was as if we'd fallen off the edge of the world. When I switched off my flashlight, the blackness was so complete I couldn't see my hand in front of my face. "This is incredible," Brian said, his voice disembodied in the dark. "When's the last time you saw stars like this?" He was right about the stars. The Milky Way stretched overhead like a river of light, so bright it cast faint shadows on the ground. But even that celestial beauty couldn't shake the feeling that something was fundamentally wrong about this place. We built our fire in a ring of stones Brian had gathered from the creek bed, and I was grateful for the warm light that pushed back the oppressive darkness. But the fire behaved strangely, sometimes flaring green or blue instead of the normal orange and red. When I mentioned it to Brian, he just shrugged. "Probably minerals in the wood," he said, poking at the logs with a stick. "Some of these cottonwoods are old enough to have absorbed all kinds of stuff from the soil." I tried to convince myself he was right, but the colored flames made my skin crawl. There was something unnatural about them, something that reminded me of the foxfire my grandfather had told me about, the ghostly lights that led travelers astray in the old stories. Our conversation grew stilted as the night wore on. Brian, usually chatty and full of stories, became increasingly quiet, staring into the fire with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. When I asked if he was feeling all right, he turned to look at me, and for just a moment his eyes reflected the firelight like an animal's. "Just tired," he said, but his voice sounded different somehow. Flatter. "Long day." I woke sometime in the small hours to the sound of my tent zipper being drawn down. Through the mesh, I could see Brian's silhouette against the dying fire. "Everything okay?" I whispered. "Thought I heard something," he replied, but he didn't move from where he stood. "Probably just a coyote." I listened but heard nothing except the whisper of wind through the grass. After a few minutes, I heard his tent zipper close and I tried to go back to sleep. But something about the way he'd stood there, perfectly motionless in the darkness, kept me awake until dawn. Morning brought relief. Brian seemed back to his normal self, joking and laughing as we made breakfast over the rebuilt fire. The strange behavior of the night before felt like it had been a dream. "Sleep okay?" he asked, handing me a cup of coffee. "Like the dead," I lied. "You?" "Best sleep I've had in months. Something about this place just feels right." We spent the morning exploring the creek bottom, finding old campsites and the remains of what might have been an Indian village, circles of stones and depressions in the earth that spoke of ancient habitation. Brian was fascinated by the archaeological possibilities, spending an hour sketching petroglyphs we found carved into a sandstone overhang. "Look at this," he said, pointing to a particularly complex symbol. "Almost looks like a map." The carving showed what appeared to be a human figure surrounded by geometric patterns, but something about the proportions was wrong. The limbs were too long, the torso too narrow, and there seemed to be extra appendages that didn't quite make sense. "Probably ceremonial," I said, though the image made me uncomfortable. "You know how stylized native art can be." Brian traced the lines with his finger, and I could have sworn I saw him shiver despite the warm afternoon sun. That evening, as we prepared dinner, Brian announced he was going to gather more firewood from the dead cottonwood he'd spotted upstream. "I'll come with you," I offered, but he shook his head. "No need, it's not far, and I could use the exercise. Too much sitting around today." He grabbed his hatchet and disappeared into the trees, his footsteps fading quickly in the soft sand of the creek bottom. I continued preparing our meal, listening for the sound of chopping wood, but the silence stretched on. After 30 minutes, I began to worry. The dead tree he'd mentioned was only a few hundred yards away, an easy walk even in the growing dusk. I called his name but got no response except the echo of my own voice. As full darkness fell, I built up the fire and kept calling for him, my voice growing hoarse with increasing panic. I wanted to go look for him, but the absolute blackness beyond the firelight was so complete that I knew I'd be lost within minutes. Hours passed. I dozed fitfully in my chair, starting awake every few minutes to call Brian's name. The fire was burning low when I finally heard footsteps approaching from upstream. "Brian," I called, relief flooding through me. "Yeah," came his voice from the darkness. "Sorry, got turned around in the dark." He stepped into the circle of firelight and my relief evaporated. Something was wrong. Brian looked like Brian, same height, same build, same features, but something fundamental had changed. His clothes were different, for one thing. He'd been wearing a red flannel shirt when he left, but now he wore a brown one I'd never seen before. And he moved differently, with a strange measured gait that didn't match his usual loose-limbed stride. "Where have you been?" I asked, trying to keep the suspicion out of my voice. I was worried sick. "Told you. Got lost." His voice was flat, emotionless. "Dark out there." "What happened to your shirt?" He looked down at himself as if seeing the brown flannel for the first time. "Tore it on a branch. Found this one in my pack." But I'd helped him pack, and I knew he'd only brought 2 shirts, the red one he'd been wearing and a blue one that was still folded in his tent. I'd seen it that morning when he'd changed clothes. "Did you get the firewood?" "Couldn't find the right tree." He sat down across from me, staring into the fire with that same unsettling intensity as the night before. "We should sleep soon. Early day tomorrow." I wanted to press him further, but something in his manner warned me off. Instead, I banked the fire and retreated to my tent, lying awake and listening to the sounds of him moving around the campsite. At some point, I heard my tent zipper again, but when I looked through the mesh, the campsite appeared empty. The fire had died to coals, and I couldn't see where Brian had gone. In the morning, I found him sitting by the rebuilt fire drinking coffee and staring at the petroglyphs we'd found the day before. He'd been up for hours, judging by the elaborate breakfast he'd prepared. Far more food than either of us could eat. "Sleep well?" he asked without looking at me. "Fine," I lied again. "You're up early." "Wanted to watch the sunrise." But we were camped in a grove of trees, with hills to the east. There was no way to see the sunrise from where we sat. When I pointed this out, he just shrugged. Must have been thinking of something else. As the day progressed, Brian's behavior became increasingly erratic. He forgot conversations we'd had the day before, claiming no memory of the petroglyphs despite having spent hours sketching them. When I showed him his own drawings, he looked at them as if seeing them for the first time. "Did I draw these?" he asked, his voice carrying a note of genuine confusion. "Yesterday afternoon, don't you remember?" He studied the sketches for a long moment, his face blank. "No." Worse was the way he moved. Brian had always been graceful for a big man, comfortable in his own skin. But now he seemed to be learning how to operate his body, moving with deliberate mechanical precision that made my skin crawl. He walked without swinging his arms, sat without shifting position, and when he spoke, he often paused as if searching for the right words. By evening, I was convinced something was seriously wrong. When Brian announced he was going to gather more firewood, I insisted on going with him. "I can handle it," he said, his voice taking on an edge I'd never heard before. "I know, but I want to help." I grabbed my own hatchet and started toward the trees. He grabbed my arm with a grip that was far stronger than it should have been. I said I can handle it. For a moment, we stared at each other, and I saw something in his eyes that made my blood freeze. They were Brian's eyes, but the intelligence behind them was alien, calculating in a way that was fundamentally inhuman. "Okay," I said carefully, "I'll tend the fire." He released my arm and walked into the darkness, leaving me alone with my growing terror. I knew I had to leave. Whatever was wearing my friend's face, it wasn't Brian. But I was miles from the truck, in country I didn't know, with no reliable way to navigate in the dark. My phone was dead, the GPS had failed completely, and the stars were hidden by clouds that had rolled in with the sunset. When Brian returned an hour later, carrying an armload of deadwood, I pretended to be reading by the fire. He dumped the wood beside the fire ring and sat down across from me, studying me with that same calculating stare. "Good book?" he asked. I looked down at the paperback in my hands, a thriller I'd read twice before. "Yeah, can't put it down." He nodded slowly, but I could see him processing the information, filing it away for some unknown purpose. We sat in silence for what felt like hours, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Finally, he spoke. "Tell me about your childhood." The request was so unexpected that I almost dropped my book. "What?" "Your childhood. We've been friends for years, but I realized I don't know much about where you came from." But we'd had this conversation a dozen times. Brian knew about my difficult relationship with my father, my mother's death when I was 16, the year I'd spent living with my grandparents in rural Nebraska. We'd bonded over our similar backgrounds, both of us raised by grandparents, both carrying the weight of family trauma. "You know all this stuff," I said carefully. His head tilted slightly like a bird studying an insect. "Refresh my memory." I told him a sanitized version of my childhood, watching his face for any sign of recognition. There was none. He listened with the same blank attention he might give to a stranger's story, occasionally nodding as if filing away useful information. When I finished, he smiled, and the expression was so wrong on his familiar features that I nearly screamed. "Interesting," he said. "Very interesting." I retreated to my tent early, claiming exhaustion, but I lay awake listening to him move around the campsite. At some point, I heard him talking, carrying on what sounded like a conversation, but there was only one voice. When I peered through the mesh, I could see him sitting by the fire speaking in a low voice to someone or something I couldn't see. The words weren't in any language I recognized. Toward dawn, I must have dozed because I woke to the sound of my tent zipper being drawn down. Through the mesh, I could see a figure crouched beside my tent, but it wasn't the right shape. Too tall, too thin, with limbs that bent at impossible angles. I lay perfectly still, barely breathing, as the thing that wore Brian's voice whispered my name. Kenneth. Kenneth, are you awake? I didn't answer, praying it would go away. I know you're awake, Kenneth. I can smell your fear. The voice was definitely Brian's, but the words were all wrong. Brian would never say something like that. The real Brian would have made a joke, would have asked if I was okay, would have shown concern for my well-being. After what felt like an eternity, the figure moved away, and I heard my tent zipper close. But I knew it was still out there, waiting. I waited until I heard what sounded like snoring from Brian's tent before carefully unzipping my sleeping bag and gathering my most essential gear. My hands shook as I stuffed items into my day pack: water, energy bars, first aid kit, compass, knife. I left everything else behind. Getting out of the tent without making noise was the longest few minutes of my life. Every small sound seemed amplified in the pre-dawn quiet. But finally, I was outside, creeping away from the camp toward what I hoped was the direction of the truck. I'd only gone a few hundred yards when I heard Brian's voice calling from behind me. "Kenneth, where are you going?" I froze, crouched behind a boulder, my heart hammering so hard I was sure he could hear it. "Kenneth, I know you're out there. Come back to camp. We need to talk." The voice was closer now, and I could hear footsteps moving through the grass with that same unnatural measured pace. I forced myself to stay hidden, biting my lip to keep from crying out. "I'm sorry if I frightened you," the voice continued, and now it sounded exactly like the old Brian. Warm, concerned, slightly hurt. "I know I've been acting strange. I think I might be sick. Something I ate, maybe. I need your help." For a moment, I almost believed it. The voice was so perfectly Brian's, so full of familiar warmth and vulnerability. But then I remembered the impossible shape I'd seen beside my tent, the alien intelligence behind those familiar eyes. I waited until the footsteps moved away before continuing my escape, using the compass to maintain a rough heading toward where I thought we'd left the truck. The pre-dawn darkness was absolute, and I stumbled constantly over rocks and prairie dog holes, but I kept moving. As the sun rose, I found myself on a low ridge overlooking the creek bottom where we'd camped. In the growing light, I could see our tents and the remains of our fire, but there was no sign of Brian. Then I saw him, or it, emerging from the trees along the creek. But something was wrong with its movement. It walked with a strange, lurching gait, as if it was still learning how to operate Brian's body. And even from this distance I could see that its proportions were subtly wrong. Too tall, too thin, with arms that hung too low. As I watched in horror, it began to change, its form shifting and flowing like liquid. For a moment, I caught a glimpse of its true appearance, something that might have been vaguely humanoid but was fundamentally alien, with too many joints and appendages that defied description. Then it noticed me. Even across the distance, I felt its attention lock onto me like a physical weight. It stood perfectly still for a moment, then began to move in my direction with a speed that was impossible for any human. I ran. I crashed through the prairie grass, my pack bouncing against my back, my lungs burning in the thin air. Behind me, I could hear it coming, not the sound of footsteps, but something else, a sliding, rustling noise like a snake moving through dry leaves. I risked a glance over my shoulder and nearly stumbled. The thing was no longer trying to maintain Brian's form. It moved across the prairie like a living shadow, flowing over obstacles instead of around them, closing the distance between us with terrifying speed. My only hope was the truck. If I could reach it, if the engine would start, I might have a chance. The keys were in my pocket. Brian had insisted I carry them as backup, and I prayed that whatever this thing was, it couldn't follow a speeding vehicle. The landscape looked different in daylight, and for a terrifying few minutes I thought I was lost. But then I spotted a familiar rock formation, and I knew I was close. I pushed myself harder, my legs screaming in protest, my vision starting to blur from exhaustion. The truck appeared through the heat shimmer like a mirage, still parked where we'd left it beside the cattle guard. I fumbled for the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get them into the lock. The engine turned over on the first try, and I nearly sobbed with relief. I threw the truck into gear and floored the accelerator, sending gravel flying as I raced down the dirt road toward civilization. I was 5 miles away before I dared to look in the rearview mirror. The road behind me was empty, but I didn't slow down until I reached the county highway. I drove straight to the sheriff's office in Liberal, but when I tried to explain what had happened, the deputy looked at me like I was crazy. I probably sounded crazy, wild-eyed, babbling about shapeshifters and things that weren't human. "So, let me get this straight," Deputy Martinez said, leaning back in his chair. "Your friend Brian got replaced by something else?" "I know how it sounds," I said, "but something happened to him out there. Something took his place. And where is this thing now?" "Still out there, as far as I know. We need to organize a search party, get some people out there with guns." "Mr. Young," the deputy interrupted, "how much sleep have you had in the last few days?" I realized how I must look, unshaven, dirty, probably reeking of sweat and fear. And my story did sound insane, even to me. "Look," Martinez continued, "camping can be stressful, especially in remote areas. Sometimes people have episodes, hallucinations. Why don't you go get cleaned up, get some rest, and if your friend isn't back by tomorrow, we'll organize a proper search." I tried to argue, but it was useless. They thought I was having some kind of breakdown, and maybe I was. Maybe the isolation and darkness had gotten to me. Maybe I'd imagined the whole thing. But I knew I hadn't. I checked into a motel in Liberal and tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw that thing moving across the prairie with inhuman speed. I called in sick to work, claiming a family emergency, and waited for news about Brian. 3 days later, a search team found our campsite. Our gear was scattered, the tents torn, and there were signs of some kind of struggle. But they found no trace of Brian Wright. The official report listed him as missing, presumed dead. The theory was that he'd encountered a wild animal, a mountain lion maybe, or a bear that had wandered down from Colorado. I didn't correct them. A week later, I got a call from Brian's mother. She'd received a postcard from him, postmarked from Denver, saying he'd decided to extend his vacation and do some solo hiking in the Rockies. The handwriting looked like his, she said. She wanted to know if I'd heard from him. I told her I hadn't, but I'd seen the postcard when she showed it to me at the memorial service. The handwriting was perfect. Too perfect. Every letter was precisely formed, as if someone had been very carefully copying Brian's writing style, and the message itself was wrong. Brian hated solo hiking. He'd told me a dozen times that half the fun of the outdoors was having someone to share it with. 6 months later, I got a Christmas card from an address in Flagstaff. Inside was a photo of Brian, or something that looked exactly like Brian, standing beside a Christmas tree with a woman I didn't recognize. They both looked happy, normal. But Brian's eyes were wrong. They were the same color, the same shape, but the intelligence behind them was alien, patient, hungry. I burned the card. I never went camping again. I moved to Denver, then Seattle, always looking over my shoulder, always wondering if that thing was still out there, still wearing my friend's face, still learning how to be human. Sometimes late at night I get calls from numbers I don't recognize. When I answer, there's just breathing on the other end. But sometimes, just before I hang up, I hear a voice that sounds exactly like Brian's, whispering my name. I've changed my number 4 times, but the calls always find me. The worst part is the doubt. In quiet moments, I almost convince myself that I imagined the whole thing, that Brian really did just get lost and die in the wilderness, that the postcards and photos are just my mind playing tricks on me. But then I remember the way it moved across the prairie, the impossible angles of its joints, the alien intelligence behind familiar eyes. And I know that somewhere out there, something is wearing my best friend's face, learning to be human one stolen identity at a time, and someday it might come looking for mine. The old-timer at the sporting goods store had been right. That country did have a way of changing folks. But he'd been wrong about one thing. It didn't change them. It replaced them. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 29 years old. This happened in the remote wilderness near Cedar Bluff Reservoir in western Kansas, 3 years ago this October. I should have known something was wrong when the coyotes went silent. My best friend since college, David Thompson, and I had planned this camping trip for months. We'd both been drowning in our respective corporate jobs, me in insurance claims, him in IT consulting, and desperately needed to disconnect from the digital world that had become our prison. David had found this spot on some obscure hiking forum, a secluded area about 15 miles southwest of Cedar Bluff State Park, where the Smoky Hills gave way to a maze of limestone canyons and hidden valleys that most people never bothered to explore. "It'll be perfect," David had said, showing me grainy satellite photos on his laptop. "No cell towers, no other campers, just us and nature, like when we were kids." The drive from Wichita took us 4 hours, with the last 90 minutes on increasingly narrow farm roads that eventually dissolved into little more than tire tracks through prairie grass. David's GPS had started acting up about an hour before we reached our destination, the screen flickering between our route and blank static. We'd laughed it off then, joking about getting lost in the middle of nowhere. We should have turned back. The spot David had chosen was a small clearing in a grove of stunted cottonwoods, nestled between two limestone bluffs that rose about 30 feet on either side. A seasonal creek bed ran along the western edge, dry now except for a few stagnant pools that reflected the late afternoon sky like black mirrors. It was beautiful in a stark, desolate way, but there was something about the silence that unsettled me from the moment we climbed out of David's Jeep. Kansas isn't supposed to be quiet. Even in the most remote areas, there's usually the rustle of wind through grass, the distant call of hawks, the scurrying of small animals through the underbrush. But here, the air hung still and heavy, as if the entire landscape was holding its breath. "This is it," David said, spreading his arms wide and grinning. His excitement was infectious, and I pushed down my unease. Miles from civilization. No deadlines, no email, no Netflix to distract us. Just good old-fashioned camping. We spent the rest of the daylight hours setting up camp. David's tent went up first, a new 2-person ultralight he'd spent too much money on, while I struggled with my ancient hand-me-down from my father. By the time we had everything arranged to David's satisfaction, he'd always been the organized one. The sun was setting behind the western bluff, painting the limestone walls in shades of orange and red that looked disturbingly like dried blood. That first night passed without incident, though I slept poorly. There were sounds, not the absence of them, which had bothered me during the day, but strange, unfamiliar noises that seemed to come from the limestone walls themselves. Soft, scratching sounds like fingernails on stone. Whispers that might have been wind through hidden crevices, except there was no wind. David slept like a log, as always. I envied him that. The next morning brought relief. The sun rose bright and warm, burning away the oppressive atmosphere of the previous evening. Birds sang in the cottonwoods, mostly crows and the occasional red-winged blackbird, and I could hear the distant rustle of small mammals in the grass. David was already up, tending a small fire and brewing coffee in a battered enamel pot. "Sleep well?" he asked, though his grin suggested he already knew the answer. "Like a baby," I lied, accepting the steaming cup he offered. The coffee was strong and bitter, exactly what I needed. We spent the morning exploring the area around our campsite. The limestone bluffs were honeycombed with small caves and crevices, most too narrow for a human to enter, but fascinating nonetheless. David had brought his camera, a serious digital SLR that he'd been trying to master, and spent a good hour photographing rock formations and the play of light and shadow on the canyon walls. It was while he was absorbed in his photography that I first saw them. Footprints in the soft earth near one of the stagnant pools. They were human, but wrong somehow. The heel was too narrow, the toe spread too wide, and they seemed to press deeper into the ground than they should have, as if whatever made them was heavier than it appeared. "Hey, David," I called, crouching down for a closer look. "Come check this out." But when he joined me 30 seconds later, the prints were gone. The earth around the pool was smooth and undisturbed, as if it had been carefully swept clean. "What am I looking at?" David asked, adjusting his camera strap. I stared at the unmarked ground, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. "Nothing, I guess. Thought I saw something." The second day followed the same pattern as the first. We hiked, we explored, we took pictures, and we enjoyed the kind of male bonding that only comes from being completely removed from civilization. David found an old Native American grinding stone embedded in one of the limestone walls, and we spent a good hour speculating about who might have used it and when. The history of the area fascinated him. He'd done research before our trip and knew that various plains tribes had used these canyons as winter camps for centuries. The Kansa tribe called this area the place where spirits walk, he told me as we shared a lunch of trail mix and jerky. The early settlers avoided it, said it was cursed. "Great," I said, trying to keep my tone light. "You brought us to a cursed canyon." "Just old superstition," David laughed, "though I have to admit, there's something about this place that gets under your skin." He was right about that. Despite the beauty of our surroundings and the pleasure of David's company, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Several times throughout the day, I caught glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision. Shadows that didn't match the movement of clouds overhead or the sense of a presence just beyond the edge of sight. But whenever I turned to look directly, there was nothing there. Our phones had died sometime during the night, despite being fully charged when we went to sleep. David's expensive GPS unit was showing our location as somewhere in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Even his mechanical compass seemed confused, the needle spinning slowly in lazy circles rather than pointing to magnetic north. "Probably some kind of mineral deposit in the rocks," David said, though he looked troubled. "Lots of iron and limestone. Blaze hell with magnetic instruments." That explanation might have been satisfactory if Kansas limestone contained significant iron deposits, which it doesn't. But neither of us said that out loud. The second night was worse than the first. The scratching sounds from the canyon walls grew louder and more persistent, occasionally accompanied by what sounded like voices speaking in a language I didn't recognize. The words, if they were words, seemed to burrow into my brain, leaving me with a headache that no amount of ibuprofen could touch. David's sleep was more restless this time. He tossed and turned in his sleeping bag, occasionally mumbling what sounded like responses to the phantom voices. At one point, I heard him say quite clearly, "Yes, I understand," though when I checked on him, his eyes were closed and his breathing was deep and regular. The third morning, David was different. The change was subtle at first. He still made coffee, still greeted me with a smile, still talked about our plans for the day, but something was off. His movements were too precise, too controlled. His smile lasted a fraction of a second too long, and his eyes had developed a peculiar intensity, as if he was studying me rather than simply looking at me. "Everything okay?" I asked, settling down across the fire from him. "Perfect," he said, and that smile flickered across his face again. Why wouldn't it be? We decided to spend the morning exploring a narrow canyon that branched off from our campsite to the north. It was barely wide enough for two people to walk side by side, with walls that rose 60 feet above our heads and curved inward, creating a tunnel-like effect that blocked out most of the sky. The floor of the canyon was carpeted with fine sand that muffled our footsteps and created an almost tomb-like silence. About a quarter-mile in, the canyon opened into a circular chamber perhaps 50 feet across, with walls that were covered in what looked like Native American petroglyphs. The symbols were unlike anything I'd seen in books or museums, twisted, organic shapes that seemed to writhe and shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. "Incredible," David breathed, immediately pulling out his camera. "These have got to be thousands of years old." But when he tried to photograph the walls, something strange happened. The images on his camera's LCD screen showed nothing but blank stone. He tried different angles, different settings, even switching to his backup camera, but the result was always the same. The petroglyphs simply refused to be captured. "Technical difficulties," he muttered, but I could see the frustration in his eyes. Or what I thought was frustration. Looking back, I'm not sure what I was seeing in his eyes anymore. We spent another hour in the chamber with David sketching the symbols in a notebook while I explored the perimeter. It was then that I found the bones. They were partially buried in the sand near the base of the far wall. Long, yellowed bones that looked disturbingly human. But they were wrong, in the same way the footprints had been wrong. Too long, too thin, with extra joints that shouldn't exist. And there were too many of them, as if they belonged to something that had too many arms, or legs, or both. "David," I called, my voice echoing strangely in the enclosed space. "You need to see this." But when I turned around, David was gone. I called his name, the sound bouncing off the walls and returning to me distorted and strange. I searched the entire chamber, checked every shadow and crevice, but he had vanished as completely as if he'd never existed. The sand where he'd been sitting showed no sign of disturbance, no footprints leading toward any of the chamber's exits. Panic rising in my throat, I ran back through the narrow canyon toward our campsite, stumbling over loose rocks and scraping my shoulders against the limestone walls. The journey seemed to take forever, the canyon stretching and warping around me like something out of a fever dream. When I finally emerged into the grove of cottonwoods, I was bleeding from a dozen small cuts and gasping for breath. The campsite was exactly as we'd left it, except that David's tent had been methodically shredded from the inside. Long, parallel tiers ran through the expensive fabric, and his gear was scattered across the clearing as if something had exploded outward from within the tent. I spent the rest of the day searching for him, calling his name until my voice was hoarse, exploring every cave and crevice within a mile of our camp. As evening approached and the shadows began to lengthen, I was forced to accept the horrible possibility that David was simply gone. That's when I heard him whistling. The tune was "Amazing Grace," David's favorite hymn from childhood, though it was being whistled in a key that sounded wrong, with notes that seemed to bend and waver in ways that made my teeth ache. The sound was coming from the direction of the seasonal creek bed, and I followed it through the gathering darkness, using my flashlight to pick my way between the scattered boulders and deadfall. I found him standing waist-deep in one of the stagnant pools, perfectly still, his back to me. He was still wearing the same clothes he'd had on that morning, but they hung on him differently now, as if his proportions had somehow changed. The whistling continued, that discordant version of the familiar hymn that made my skin crawl. "David?" I called softly. He stopped whistling but didn't turn around. "Hello, Michael," he said, and his voice was exactly the same as always, which somehow made it even more terrifying. "I've been waiting for you." "Where have you been? I've been looking everywhere for you." "I've been learning," he said, and slowly began to turn around. Learning such wonderful things. When he faced me, I saw that it was David, and it wasn't David. The features were right. The same brown hair, the same crooked nose he'd broken playing hockey in college, the same slightly lopsided smile. But the eyes were different. They were David's eyes, but they were looking at me with an intelligence that was ancient and hungry and completely alien. "David, what happened to you?" "Nothing happened to me," he said, taking a step toward the edge of the pool. "Everything happened to what was in me. The empty spaces, they're full now." The water around him began to ripple, though there was no wind. As he moved closer to shore, I could see that the liquid clinging to his clothes wasn't water. It was too thick, too dark, and it moved with a life of its own. "The old ones have been sleeping here for so long," David continued, his voice taking on a sing-song quality that made my stomach turn. Waiting for someone to show them the way out, I was happy to help. He was at the edge of the pool now, and I could see that his skin had taken on a grayish pallor. Worse, there were things moving underneath it, small, discreet bulges that traveled across his face and neck like insects crawling beneath fabric. "You're not David," I whispered, backing away. "I'm more David than David ever was," he said, and laughed. The sound was like breaking glass. "I have all his memories, all his feelings. Did you know he was jealous of you, Michael? Jealous of your job, your girlfriend, your easy confidence? He used to lie awake at night thinking about all the ways he could hurt you." "That's not true." "Oh, but it is." David took another step forward, and I noticed that his feet weren't quite touching the ground. "He invited you here to kill you, you know. Not consciously, perhaps, but the desire was there. The old ones could smell it on him the moment he arrived. That's why they chose him. I was running before I'd consciously decided to move, crashing through the underbrush and stumbling over rocks in my haste to get away from the thing that wore my best friend's face. Behind me, I could hear it laughing. David's laugh, but wrong, like a recording played at the wrong speed. I made it back to the campsite and began throwing my gear into my backpack with shaking hands. The Jeep keys were in David's pocket, wherever David really was, but I knew the general direction back to the main road. If I hiked through the night, I could reach civilization by morning. That's when David walked into the circle of light cast by my flashlight. He looked perfectly normal now. No gray skin, no things crawling beneath the surface, just my friend David with a concerned expression on his face. "Mike, what are you doing?" he asked. "What's wrong?" I stared at him, my hands frozen on the zipper of my pack. "You were in the pool. You said..." "What pool?" David looked genuinely confused. "I've been looking for you for hours. You disappeared in that canyon and I've been worried sick. Are you feeling all right? You look terrible." For a moment, I almost believed him. The relief I felt at seeing my friend safe and normal was so intense that I wanted to accept his explanation, to pretend that what I'd seen by the creek bed had been some kind of hallucination brought on by stress and dehydration. But then I noticed his clothes. They were completely dry. "You're lying," I said, slowly reaching for the hunting knife on my belt. David's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes. "Mike, you're scaring me. What are you talking about? Your clothes should be wet. You were standing in that pool, and your clothes should be wet. I don't know what you think you saw. Liar!" The thing that looked like David smiled then, and this time it didn't bother to make the expression look human. The corners of his mouth stretched too wide, revealing teeth that were too sharp and too numerous. "Clever boy," it said in David's voice. The old David never would have noticed something like that. It moved toward me with inhuman speed, covering the 10 feet between us in a single fluid motion that was more like flowing than running. I had the knife out and was swinging it in a desperate arc, but the thing caught my wrist with fingers that felt like steel cables. "The old ones are hungry, Michael," it whispered, its face inches from mine. "They've been sleeping in the stone for so long, dreaming of flesh and blood and the sweet taste of terror. David was just the first course. I drove my knee upward, catching it in what should have been its solar plexus. The impact sent it staggering backward, though it didn't seem to feel any pain. More importantly, it loosened its grip on my wrist long enough for me to break free. I ran again, this time toward the narrow opening between the limestone bluffs that marked the way back to the main trail. Behind me, I could hear the thing that had been David laughing and calling my name, but I didn't look back. The sound of its voice was changing as I got further away, becoming less human and more like the whispers I'd been hearing from the canyon walls. The next few hours were a nightmare of stumbling through darkness, guided only by the beam of my flashlight and a compass that spun wildly but at least gave me a general sense of direction. Every shadow looked like David. Every sound was his footsteps behind me. Every whisper of wind through the grass was his voice calling my name. I fell down a wash and twisted my ankle. I walked through a patch of prickly pear cactus and filled my leg with spines. I got lost twice and had to backtrack, burning precious battery life from my flashlight, but I kept moving, driven by the absolute certainty that whatever was wearing David's face was still following me. Dawn found me collapsed beside a farm road, 20 miles from where we'd parked the Jeep. A rancher named Tom Hutchins found me there and drove me to the hospital in Hayes, where I was treated for dehydration, exhaustion, and what the doctors politely called acute stress reaction. I told them David had fallen into a ravine and that I'd been unable to find him in the dark. Search and rescue teams combed the area for 3 days but found nothing. No trace of David, no trace of our campsite, nothing but empty canyons and limestone walls that showed no sign of recent human habitation. The official report listed David Thompson as missing, presumed dead due to misadventure. His family held a memorial service. His company sent flowers. I was treated as a traumatized survivor and offered counseling services that I accepted but found useless. Because how do you explain to a therapist that your best friend was possessed by something ancient and evil that's still out there, still wearing his face, still waiting for the next group of unsuspecting campers to wander into its domain? I never went camping again. I moved to Oregon 6 months later, as far from Kansas as I could get while staying in the continental United States. I changed my phone number, deleted my social media accounts, and did everything I could to disappear from my old life. But sometimes, late at night, my phone rings. And when I answer it, I hear David's voice on the other end, asking when I'm coming back to visit him in the canyon where the spirits walk. I always hang up, but the calls keep coming. And sometimes, in the background, I can hear them laughing, voices that sound like wind through limestone caves, promising that they're still hungry, still waiting, still dreaming of flesh and blood and the sweet taste of terror. The official reports say David Thompson died 3 years ago in a hiking accident in western Kansas. But I know better. David Thompson is still alive, in a manner of speaking. He's still out there in those canyons near Cedar Bluff Reservoir, wearing a face that used to belong to my best friend, waiting for the next group of campers who think they're brave enough to spend a few nights in the place where spirits walk. If you're reading this and thinking about taking a camping trip to the remote areas around Cedar Bluff, don't. Find somewhere else to commune with nature, somewhere with cell phone coverage and park rangers and lots of other people around. Because the old ones are still sleeping in the stone, and they're always hungry for new hosts. And once they have you, they never let go. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 28 years old. This happened in the remote backcountry of the Flint Hills region in eastern Kansas, in a place locals call Devil's Backbone Ridge, a jagged limestone outcropping that cuts through the endless prairie like a scar. I should have listened to the warnings. It was supposed to be a simple 3-day camping trip with my college roommates, myself, Jake Morrison, Sarah Chen, and Lisa Gonzalez. We'd been planning this getaway for months, needing to escape the suffocating routine of our corporate jobs in Kansas City. Jake had discovered this isolated area while researching lesser-known hiking trails, a remote section of the Flint Hills where few tourists ventured. The nearest town, Cedar Vale, was a dying grain elevator community 40 miles away. "It'll be perfect," Jake had insisted, spreading topographical maps across my kitchen table. No cell towers, no crowds, just us and nature. His enthusiasm was infectious, and despite my growing unease about venturing so far from civilization, I'd agreed. Now, as our rental SUV bounced along the deteriorating gravel road that led deeper into the hills, I wondered if this had been a mistake. The October sky hung low and gray, heavy with the promise of rain. The prairie grass stretched endlessly in all directions, broken only by occasional groves of cottonwood and bur oak that huddled in the valleys like frightened refugees. According to the GPS, we should reach the trailhead in about 10 minutes, Sarah announced from the passenger seat, though her voice carried a note of uncertainty. She'd been trying to get a signal on her phone for the past hour, holding it up to the window at various angles like some kind of technological divining rod. "Assuming we don't get lost first," Lisa muttered from behind me. She'd been growing increasingly nervous as we'd driven further from anything resembling civilization. When was the last time we saw another car? I glanced in the rearview mirror. The road behind us had disappeared over a rolling hill, swallowed by the vastness. Relax. Jake researched this place thoroughly. Right, Jake? But Jake wasn't listening. He sat hunched over a paper map, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Something's not right," he said finally. "We should have passed Cottonwood Creek 10 minutes ago, but I haven't seen any water." "Maybe the creek dried up," Sarah suggested, though she sounded doubtful. "In October? After all the rain we've had?" Jake shook his head. "No. Something's off. The landmarks don't match." An uncomfortable silence settled over the car. Outside, the landscape had begun to change subtly. The rolling prairie gave way to more rugged terrain, with rocky outcroppings and deeper valleys. The grass looked different too, older somehow, with patches of sickly yellow that stood out against the autumn brown like infected wounds. "There," Lisa pointed ahead. "Is that the trail marker?" A weathered wooden post stood beside the road, leaning at a precarious angle. As we drew closer, I could make out faded lettering. Devil's Backbone Trail, 4.5 miles to Hollow. Below that, in fresher paint that looked almost garish against the weathered wood, someone had added, "Turn back." "Charming," Sarah said dryly. "Probably just local kids trying to scare people," Jake replied, but his voice lacked conviction. I pulled the SUV onto a small cleared area beside the trail marker and killed the engine. The silence that followed was absolute. No bird songs, no insect buzz, not even the whisper of wind through grass. It was as if the entire landscape was holding its breath. "Well," I said, forcing cheerfulness into my voice, "let's get our gear and find this campsite." The trail started as a clear path through the prairie grass, marked by occasional cairns of stacked limestone. But within half a mile, it began to descend into a valley I couldn't see on Jake's map. The grass grew taller here, sometimes reaching above our heads, and the temperature seemed to drop with each step downward. "This doesn't feel right," Lisa whispered, stopping suddenly. "Listen." We stood still, backpacks heavy on our shoulders, and listened. That's when I heard it, or rather, didn't hear it. No insects, no birds. Even our own breathing seemed muffled, as if the air itself was too thick. "Maybe there's a weather front moving in," Sarah suggested, though she kept glancing nervously at the grass walls that pressed in on either side of the trail. "Weather doesn't make bugs disappear," Jake said. He pulled out his GPS unit and frowned at the display. "This thing's going crazy. It shows us in 3 different locations simultaneously." The trail curved sharply to the left, and suddenly we emerged into a circular clearing about 50 yards across. In the center stood a ring of ancient cottonwood trees, their trunks twisted into bizarre spirals that hurt to look at directly. The grass within the ring was dead, not autumn brown, but black, as if it had been burned and never recovered. "Well, this is cozy," Lisa said with forced humor. "Actually, it's perfect," Jake countered, though he sounded less certain than usual. "The trees will provide windbreak, and look, there's a creek." He was right. A narrow stream meandered along the far edge of the clearing, its water so dark it looked like liquid shadow. But as we approached, I noticed something that made my stomach clench. The water flowed uphill. I blinked hard, thinking it must be an optical illusion, but there was no mistaking it. The stream defied gravity, flowing steadily upward toward a point somewhere beyond the tree line where it seemed to vanish into thin air. "Guys," I started to say, but Jake was already dropping his pack. "This is it. This is our campsite." He began pulling out tent stakes with almost manic enthusiasm. "We'll set up camp, get a fire going, and tomorrow we'll explore the ridge." Sarah and Lisa exchanged glances, and I could see my own unease reflected in their faces. But what could we say? We'd driven 4 hours to get here, and the sun was already sinking toward the horizon. We had little choice but to make camp. Setting up took longer than usual. Our tents kept pulling away from their stakes as if the ground itself was rejecting them. The fire pit Jake built with limestone rocks refused to hold its shape. The stones would mysteriously shift position when no one was looking, forcing him to rebuild it 3 times. But the real problem became apparent when Jake tried to light the fire. "What the hell?" He struck match after match, but each flame died the moment it touched the kindling. Even when he managed to get the tinder smoking, the smoke rose in impossible spirals that defied the still air, forming shapes that looked almost like reaching hands before dissolving. "Maybe the wood's damp," Sarah suggested weakly. "I brought fire starter fluid," Jake said, dousing the wood liberally. This time the fire caught, but the flames burned blue-green instead of orange, casting eerie shadows that seemed to move independently of the light source. "That's unusual," Lisa said, her voice barely above a whisper. "High mineral content in the wood," Jake insisted, but I could hear the doubt creeping into his voice. "Copper, maybe." We ate a cold dinner of sandwiches and granola bars, not trusting the strange fire to cook anything. Conversation was stilted, punctuated by long silences during which we all strained to hear sounds that never came. As darkness fell, the fire's unnatural glow became our only illumination. Our flashlights had all mysteriously drained their batteries despite being fully charged that morning. "I think I'll turn in early," Lisa announced, getting to her feet with obvious relief. "Long day tomorrow." "Good idea," Sarah agreed quickly. "We all need rest." But rest didn't come easily. I lay in my sleeping bag for what felt like hours, listening to the absolute silence outside my tent. Even my friends seemed to be holding their breath. I couldn't hear the usual sounds of people sleeping. No snoring, no rustling of fabric, nothing. Around midnight, I heard something that made my blood freeze. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps circling our camp. Not the random wandering of an animal, but the measured pace of something, or someone, with intelligence and purpose. The steps made no sound in the dead grass, but I could feel the vibrations through the ground, a rhythmic pressure that seemed to sync with my own heartbeat. I held my breath and listened. The footsteps continued their circuit, past my tent, past Sarah's, past Lisa's, past Jake's. Around and around, never pausing, never varying their pace. Whatever was out there was studying us, learning our positions. When dawn finally came, I emerged from my tent feeling like I hadn't slept at all. The others looked equally haggard, with dark circles under their eyes and the pale, drawn faces of people who'd spent the night fighting terror. "Did anyone else hear?" Sarah began. "The footsteps," Jake finished grimly. "Yeah, all night." "What do we do?" Lisa's voice was barely controlled panic. "We pack up and leave," I said firmly. "This place is wrong. I don't know how or why, but something's not right here." But when we checked our gear, we discovered our first real problem. Our water bottles, all of them, had emptied overnight. Not leaked, the bottles were intact and tightly sealed. The water had simply vanished. "That's impossible," Jake said, turning his empty bottle upside down and shaking it. "Everything about this place is impossible," I replied. "That's why we're leaving." "With what water?" Sarah asked pointedly. "It's a 4-hour hike back to the car, and it's going to be hot today." We looked at the dark creek flowing impossibly upward. None of us wanted to drink from it, but we might not have a choice. "I'll refill the bottles," Jake volunteered, though he looked sick at the prospect. "We'll boil it first, use purification tablets." "I'll come with you," I said. I didn't want anyone going near that stream alone. The water looked even darker up close, almost black, with an oily sheen that reflected the morning light in unnatural colors. Jake knelt beside the bank and dipped his bottle in. The moment it touched the surface, the water began to bubble and foam as if it were boiling, though it remained ice cold. "Jesus Christ," Jake breathed, jerking his hand back. The bubbling subsided, and in the now still surface I saw something that made me stumble backward. A face looked up at us from the water, not a reflection, but a face beneath the surface, pale and distorted, with black holes where the eyes should be. Its mouth opened in a silent scream. "We're leaving," I said, my voice cracking. "Right now. We'll risk the dehydration." But when we returned to camp, we found Lisa standing perfectly still beside the cold fire pit, staring into the trees with a blank expression I'd never seen before. "Lisa?" Sarah approached her cautiously. "Are you okay?" Lisa turned to look at us and I felt my heart skip. Her eyes were wrong, not the warm brown I knew, but completely black, like the eyes of the thing in the water. When she smiled, her teeth looked too sharp. "I'm fine," she said, but her voice had a strange musical quality that hadn't been there before. "Just enjoying the morning." "We need to go," I said carefully, not taking my eyes off her. "We're packing up now." "Why?" Lisa tilted her head at an unnatural angle. "We just got here, and there's so much to explore." Jake stepped closer to me. "That's not Lisa," he whispered. The thing wearing Lisa's face giggled, a sound like wind chimes made of bone. "Of course I'm Lisa. Who else would I be?" Sarah backed toward her tent. "You're scaring us. You're acting really strange." "Strange?" No, not Lisa's, smile widened impossibly. "Nothing strange about wanting to stay in such a beautiful place, forever and ever and ever." That's when I noticed Lisa's feet weren't quite touching the ground. "Run," I whispered. We scattered in different directions. I heard Sarah scream behind me as I crashed through the tall grass, Jake close on my heels. Branches whipped at my face and rocks turned under my feet, but I didn't stop running until we reached the trail we'd hiked in on. "Where's Sarah?" Jake gasped, doubled over and breathing hard. I looked back toward the clearing, but the grass had already closed behind us like a curtain. No sign of Sarah, no sound of pursuit. "We have to go back for her," Jake said. "That wasn't Lisa," I replied, still trying to process what I'd seen. "That thing, it wasn't human." "But Sarah is probably dead." The words tasted like ashes in my mouth. Whatever happened to Lisa happened to her too. Jake stared at me in horror. "You're talking about leaving them." "I'm talking about survival." I grabbed his arm. "Look at me, Jake. Really look. Do I look like myself?" He studied my face with growing alarm. "Your eyes. They're lighter than they were yesterday." I felt cold dread wash over me. "How long do you think we have before we're not ourselves anymore?" "I don't know." His voice was barely a whisper. "God, I don't know." We started back up the trail, moving as fast as we dared, but within minutes it became clear that something was wrong. The path seemed to stretch and contract like a living thing. Landmarks we'd passed an hour earlier appeared and disappeared. The GPS was useless, spinning through coordinates that placed us everywhere and nowhere. "We're going in circles," Jake said after we passed the same distinctive boulder for the third time. "The trail's changing," I replied. "It's not letting us leave." That's when we heard them coming through the grass behind us. Footsteps, multiple sets, moving with that same measured, unnatural pace we'd heard during the night, and voices. Familiar voices calling our names. "Michael! Jake!" It was Sarah's voice, but with that same musical quality I'd heard in Lisa's. "Where are you going?" Lisa's voice joined in. "Come back to camp. We need to talk." The voices were getting closer. "This way," Jake whispered, pointing to a gap in the grass that led off the main trail. We pushed through the towering stalks, thorns catching at our clothes and skin. Behind us, the voices continued their sing-song calling, but they seemed to be moving away now, following the false trail we'd abandoned. The grass thinned as we climbed higher, emerging onto the rocky spine of Devil's Backbone Ridge. From here, I could see for miles across the prairie, but what I saw made no sense. The landscape rolled away in all directions, but there was no road, no sign of our SUV, no indication that civilization existed anywhere in this vast emptiness. "Look," Jake pointed down into the valley where we'd camped. The clearing was visible from this height, but it looked different now. Larger, and in the center, where our tents had been, I could see figures moving in a slow, ritualistic dance around the twisted cottonwood trees. Even at this distance, I could tell they weren't human. Their movements were too fluid, too graceful, like marionettes being controlled by an expert puppeteer. "How many are there?" Jake asked. I counted. 7, maybe 8. There were only 4 of us. The implications hit us both at the same time. The things down there weren't just wearing the faces of our friends. They were multiplying, creating more of themselves, and we were trapped here with them. As we watched, one of the figures looked up toward our position on the ridge. Even at this distance, I could see its smile, too wide, too sharp, reflecting the pale morning light like polished bone. It raised one arm and waved. "We need to find another way down," I said, backing away from the edge. But as we explored the ridge, we discovered the horrible truth. Devil's Backbone was aptly named. It was a narrow spine of rock with sheer drops on both sides. There were only 3 ways down: the trail we'd come up, which led back to the clearing, a treacherous rock face that would require climbing gear we didn't have, and there. Jake pointed to the far end of the ridge where the limestone seemed to form natural steps leading down into another valley. That might be passable. It was our only option. The descent took most of the day. The rock was loose and treacherous, and more than once we had to backtrack when what looked like a path turned into a dead end. But eventually, we reached the bottom of a narrow canyon I didn't remember seeing on any map. "Which direction?" Jake asked. The canyon ran roughly east-west, both directions disappearing into shadow. I tried to remember where the sun had been when we'd started our descent, but time seemed elastic in this place. It might have been noon or evening. The light had that strange, directionless quality I'd noticed since we'd arrived. "East," I decided arbitrarily. "Maybe we can find another way back to the road." We walked for what felt like hours through the winding canyon. The walls grew higher and closer together until we were walking in perpetual twilight. Strange markings covered the rock faces. Not ancient petroglyphs, but something else. Symbols that hurt to look at directly, carved deep into the stone as if by claws rather than tools. Jake stopped suddenly. "Do you hear that?" I listened. In the distance, very faint, came the sound of voices. Human voices, speaking words I couldn't quite make out. "Other hikers?" I suggested hopefully. "Or something pretending to be other hikers," Jake replied grimly. But we had little choice. We needed water, food, and most importantly, a way out of this nightmare. We crept forward, following the sound through the twisting canyon. The voices grew clearer as we approached. Multiple people talking casually about normal things. The weather, their jobs, their families. It sounded so blessedly normal after everything we'd experienced that I felt tears of relief welling up in my eyes. We rounded a bend and saw them. 3 people sitting around a small camp stove, sharing what looked like a hot meal. 2 men and a woman, all in their 30s with expensive hiking gear and the healthy tans of serious outdoors enthusiasts. "Hello," one of the men called out, waving cheerfully. "You folks look like you could use some help." They seemed genuinely friendly, genuinely human. No black eyes, no unnatural movements, no musical voices. Just normal people in an abnormal place. "Thank God," Jake breathed, and I felt my own relief threatening to overwhelm me. We approached their camp cautiously, but they made no threatening moves. The woman, who introduced herself as Dr. Amanda Martinez, offered us water and energy bars. The 2 men, David and Robert, were brothers from Colorado who'd been hiking in Kansas as part of a cross-country adventure. "We've been lost for 2 days," Amanda explained. "Our GPS went haywire and all our electronic equipment died. We finally found this canyon and decided to wait for help." "How long have you been here?" I asked. "Since yesterday morning," David replied. "We heard helicopters earlier today, so we think a search party's looking for us." Their story sounded plausible, even comforting. But something nagged at me. A detail that didn't quite fit. "You said your electronic equipment died," I said slowly. but you're using a camp stove." "It's butane," Robert explained. "Doesn't need electronics." That made sense. But as I looked more closely at their setup, I noticed other details that didn't add up. Their gear looked brand new, despite claiming to have been hiking for days. Their clothes were clean. Most telling of all, they had no insects around their food. In fact, I realized I hadn't seen a single bug since we'd entered the canyon. "Jake," I said quietly, "we should go." But Jake was already accepting a cup of hot coffee from Amanda, his face brightening for the first time since this nightmare had started. "This is exactly what we needed," he said gratefully. "Don't drink that," I hissed, but it was too late. Jake had already taken a long sip. The change was immediate. His eyes widened, then slowly turned black from rim to rim. His mouth stretched into that too-wide smile I'd seen on the thing wearing Lisa's face. "Michael," he said in that musical voice, "you should try some. It's delicious." The three strangers were all smiling now, their faces shifting and flowing like water. Amanda's features rearranged themselves into a grotesque parody of beauty, while the brothers' faces merged and separated in impossible ways. I ran. Behind me, I heard Jake's voice calling my name, but it wasn't Jake anymore. It was just another puppet being controlled by whatever malevolent force had claimed this place. The canyon walls blurred past as I ran, my lungs burning and my legs threatening to give out. But I didn't stop until I reached a section where the walls were low enough to climb. I scrambled up the loose rock, cutting my hands and knees, driven by pure terror. At the top, I found myself back on the endless prairie. But this wasn't the same landscape we'd driven through yesterday. The grass was too tall, too uniform, stretching to the horizon in every direction without variation. There were no roads, no power lines, no sign that humans had ever existed here. I was completely, utterly alone. As night fell, I tried to make sense of what had happened. The evidence suggested that whatever force controlled this place could create perfect duplicates of people. Not just their appearance, but their memories, their mannerisms, everything. The only way to tell them apart was the eyes, and by then it was usually too late. I thought about Sarah and Lisa, probably dead since yesterday morning. I thought about Jake, whose face I'd never see again, only the mockery wearing his skin. And I thought about those three hikers in the canyon who'd been so perfectly normal except for the small details that gave them away. How long had they been waiting there? How many other victims had they lured to their deaths with promises of help and safety? I spent the night huddled against a boulder, afraid to sleep, afraid to move, afraid to make any sound that might attract attention. Several times I heard voices in the distance, sometimes familiar, sometimes not, calling out across the prairie. Once, I could have sworn I heard my own voice calling my name. When dawn came, I made a decision. I couldn't escape this place through normal means. Every path led back to itself. Every direction was the wrong direction. But there might be another way. I needed to go back to the source. Back to that clearing with its twisted trees and impossible stream. Whatever power controlled this realm, it originated there. The journey back took all day. I had to navigate by the sun and by instinct, avoiding the false trails that tried to lead me astray. Several times I encountered the duplicates, Jake and Sarah and Lisa, all calling to me sweetly, begging me to come back to camp. I ignored them and pressed on. As evening approached, I finally saw the ring of cottonwood trees ahead. The clearing looked exactly as we'd left it, except for one detail. Our tents were gone. In their place stood a small cabin that definitely hadn't been there before. A ramshackle structure of weathered boards and corrugated metal that looked like it had been there for decades. Smoke rose from its chimney, and warm light glowed in the windows. I approached cautiously, every instinct screaming at me to run. But I'd come too far to turn back now. I needed answers, and this was the only place I might find them. The door stood slightly ajar. From inside, I could hear the sound of a radio playing softly, some old country song that seemed familiar but wrong somehow, as if the lyrics had been subtly changed. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The cabin's interior was a single room furnished with antiques that looked genuinely old. A wood stove crackled in one corner, and kerosene lamps provided the flickering light I'd seen from outside. Seated at a rough wooden table was an elderly man I'd never seen before, hunched over what looked like a hand-drawn map. He looked up as I entered, and I was relieved to see that his eyes were normal, pale blue, not black, but his smile was tired and sad in a way that made my heart sink. "You're the last one," he said in a voice like rustling leaves. "I've been waiting for you, Michael Williams." "Who are you?" I managed to ask. "Name's Harold Cutters. I used to be the caretaker for this land, back when it belonged to the Osage Nation. That was before the government moved them out, before the railroad came through, before—" He gestured vaguely at the walls. "Before all this." "All what?" "The hungry place," Harold said simply. "That's what the Osage called it. A wound in the world where something got in that shouldn't have. They built cairns to mark the boundaries, performed ceremonies to keep it contained. But after they were forced out—" He shrugged. "Who was left to maintain the barriers?" I sank into the chair across from him, feeling the weight of exhaustion and horror finally catching up with me. "My friends are gone," Harold said gently. "The hungry place took them, like it takes everyone who stays too long. It feeds on human consciousness, human identity. It wears people like clothes. Then why aren't you affected? Why am I still me?" Harold held up his left hand, and I saw that it was missing the ring finger. Not a clean amputation, but a ragged wound that looked recent despite his claim to have been here for decades. "Blood price," he explained. "The old ways require sacrifice to maintain protection. I've been feeding it pieces of myself for 40 years, keeping just enough humanity to remember why I'm here." "To do what?" "To wait for someone strong enough to close the wound." His pale eyes fixed on mine. "Someone like you." "I'm not strong enough for anything," I said bitterly. "I couldn't even save my friends." "Your friends were lost the moment they drank from the stream," Harold replied. "But you resisted. You saw through the illusions. You found your way here." He spread the map on the table between us. "That takes strength most people don't have." The map showed the clearing in intricate detail, including symbols and notations I couldn't read. At the center, where the twisted cottonwood trees stood, someone had drawn a spiral in what looked like dried blood. "The heart of the hungry place," Harold explained. "A confluence point where the barriers between worlds are thin. If it can be sealed again, properly sealed, the entity will be trapped and starved back into dormancy." "How?" Harold stood slowly, his joints creaking like old wood. From a shelf beside the stove, he retrieved an object wrapped in oiled leather. When he unwrapped it, I saw a knife unlike anything I'd ever seen. The blade was black glass, napped to a razor edge, and the handle was carved bone inscribed with symbols that seemed to writhe in the lamplight. "Obsidian and bone," Harold said. "Old tools for old work. The Osage shamans used this to create the original barriers." He held it out to me. "Now you'll use it to repair them. I don't know how." "You'll know," Harold interrupted. "When the time comes, you'll know." He walked to the door and opened it. Outside, full darkness had fallen, but I could see shapes moving among the twisted trees. Dozens of them now, all the people the hungry place had claimed over the years, wearing their faces but serving its will. "They won't enter here," Harold said. "This cabin exists in a pocket of protected space, but come morning, that protection will fade. You'll have one chance to reach the heart and complete the ritual." "What ritual?" "Blood calls to blood," Harold said cryptically. "The barrier was built with sacrifice, and sacrifice will rebuild it." He looked at his maimed hand meaningfully. "But this time, it won't be a finger or a toe. This time, it requires everything." The implications of his words hit me like a physical blow. "You're talking about suicide." "I'm talking about sacrifice," Harold corrected. There's a difference. One is despair, the other is purpose. I stared at the knife in my hands, its black blade reflecting the lamplight like a shard of night sky. There has to be another way. There isn't. Harold's voice was firm but not unkind. I've had 40 years to look for alternatives. This is the only path. Outside, the shapes among the trees began to call my name. I recognized Sarah's voice, Lisa's voice, Jake's voice, all pleading with me to come out, to join them, to stop fighting and accept what I couldn't change. But underneath their words, I heard something else. Hunger. The vast, empty hunger of something that had been feeding for decades and still wasn't satisfied. Something that would keep feeding until there was nothing left to consume. I thought about all the hikers who must have come here over the years, drawn by the promise of wilderness and solitude. I thought about the families who would never know what happened to their loved ones, who would spend years hoping for answers that would never come. And I thought about what would happen if this thing ever found a way to expand beyond its current boundaries, if it could spread to the towns and cities beyond the prairie, wearing the faces of millions while it devoured their souls from within. "Tell me what I need to do," I said finally. Harold smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen since this nightmare began. "At dawn, you'll walk to the center of the grove. The things wearing your friends' faces will try to stop you, but they can't actually harm you while you carry the knife. When you reach the spiral, you'll know what comes next." "How can you be sure?" "Because the knife remembers," Harold said. "It's killed for this purpose before, and it will guide your hand when the time comes." We spent the rest of the night in silence. Harold dozed fitfully in his chair while I sat by the window, watching the shapes move among the trees. They never came closer than the edge of the grove, but they never stopped calling either. Their voices wove together into a hypnotic chorus that promised peace, rest, reunion with my friends. It would be so easy to just walk outside and join them. When the first pale light of dawn touched the horizon, Harold woke. "It's time," he said simply. I stood, the obsidian knife heavy in my hand. "Will it hurt?" "Everything worthwhile hurts," Harold replied. "But the pain ends. The purpose remains." I opened the door and stepped into the morning air. Immediately, the shapes among the trees stopped their calling and began moving toward me. They took the forms of Sarah, Lisa, and Jake, but also strangers. Dozens of people I'd never seen before, all wearing the same black eyes and musical voices. "Michael?" Sarah's voice called sweetly. "You don't have to do this. We can be together forever here. Isn't that what you've always wanted?" "Just put down the knife," Jake added, his face twisted into an expression of false concern. "You're scaring us." But I could see through their masks now. Beneath the familiar faces were things of shadow and hunger, parasites wearing human skin like ill-fitting costumes. They pressed closer, but as Harold had promised, they couldn't actually touch me while I held the blade. I walked slowly toward the center of the grove, where the spiral pattern was carved into the earth between the twisted cottonwood trees. The creatures, I couldn't think of them as my friends anymore, formed a circle around me, reaching out with grasping hands that stopped just short of contact. "Please," Lisa begged, tears streaming down her face. "I'm still me. We're all still here, trapped inside. You can save us." For a moment, I almost believed her. The performance was perfect, the emotion genuine seeming. But then I remembered the thing in the water, the face with holes for eyes, and I knew the truth. My friends were gone. These were just echoes, shadows puppeted by something vast and hungry. I reached the center of the spiral and knelt down. The carved lines in the earth were filled with a substance that looked like dried blood, and as I touched the obsidian blade to the pattern, the grooves began to glow with pale fire. The creatures surrounding me stopped their pleading and began to scream. The sound was inhuman. Not the voices of people in pain, but the shriek of something ancient and furious being denied its feast. The false faces melted away, revealing the writhing shadows beneath. They pressed against some invisible barrier, clawing at the air inches from my skin. The knife grew warm in my hand, and suddenly I could feel its history. I saw the Osage shamans who had first used it, standing in this same spot centuries ago, making the same sacrifice I was about to make. I felt their courage, their resolve, their love for the people they were protecting. I understood what I had to do. The blade sliced across my palm with surgical precision, and my blood dripped onto the spiral pattern. Where it touched, the pale fire flared brighter, and the screaming of the shadows grew louder. But it wasn't enough. The wound Harold had spoken of ran too deep, had been feeding too long. It would take more than a few drops to seal it properly. I pressed the blade to my wrist. "Wait." The voice came from behind me, and I turned to see Harold standing at the edge of the grove. But he looked different now. Younger, more solid, as if the approaching dawn had restored some vital essence to him. "There might be another way," he said, stepping carefully into the circle. "I've been thinking about it all night, and there's something the old stories mentioned. A way to share the burden." "What do you mean?" "Two souls, freely given, burn brighter than one forced to sacrifice," Harold said, extending his already damaged hand. "If we both choose this path..." I understood immediately. Not suicide, but willing sacrifice. Not despair, but hope for everyone else who might wander into this hungry place. I took his hand, and together we pressed our bleeding palms to the spiral. The effect was immediate and overwhelming. Power rushed through the carved lines like lightning, spreading outward from the center in expanding rings. The shadows screamed and writhed, but the barriers that had contained them for centuries blazed back to life, forcing them back into whatever dark realm they'd crawled from. The last thing I remember clearly was the sensation of falling, not down, but inward, into the spiral itself. I felt Harold beside me, his presence steady and calm, and I felt something else, gratitude from the land itself, from the prairie grass and the limestone bedrock and the vast sky overhead. We had given it peace. I woke up in a hospital bed in Wichita, hooked to more machines than I could count. The doctors told me I'd been found unconscious beside my SUV on a county road outside Cedar Vale, severely dehydrated and suffering from exposure. They said I'd been raving about my friends, but there was no sign of them anywhere. The official story was that we'd gotten separated during our hike, and that I'd managed to make it back to the car while they remained lost somewhere in the vast prairie. Search teams combed the area for weeks but found no trace of Sarah, Lisa, or Jake. Eventually, they were declared missing, presumed dead. I tried to tell people the truth, but who would believe such a story? Hungry places and shadow creatures, shamans and blood sacrifices. It sounded like the ravings of someone who'd spent too long alone in the wilderness. Even I began to doubt my own memories after a while. But there are things that keep the truth alive for me. The thin, white scar across my palm that no doctor can explain. The fact that my blood type changed after the incident, something the medical staff attributed to trauma-induced testing errors, and, most tellingly, the obsidian knife I found in my jacket pocket when they returned my personal effects. No one else can see it. To them, it's just an empty pocket. But I can feel its weight, its warmth, its patient readiness. It's waiting for the next time it's needed, because wounds like the one in the Flint Hills don't stay healed forever. They require maintenance, vigilance, the willingness of people like Harold and me to stand watch. I've gone back to that area twice since my recovery. Both times I found nothing but ordinary prairie, rolling grassland, grazing cattle, oil derricks pumping their slow rhythm against the Kansas sky. No spiral clearing, no twisted trees, no impossible stream flowing uphill. But I know it's still there, waiting beneath the surface like a dormant volcano. And someday, someone else will have to make the choice Harold and I made. Someone else will have to decide whether their life is worth trading for the safety of countless strangers. I hope when that time comes, they'll be stronger than I was. I hope they'll be ready. But until then, I keep the knife close and listen for stories of hikers who disappear in remote places. Because there are other hungry places in the world, other wounds that need tending. And I've learned that some kinds of work never really end. My name is Michael Williams and I am 34 years old. This happened in the remote Flint Hills region of Kansas near the Tallgrass Prairie National Preserve in October of last year. I should have listened to my gut when everything started going wrong, but hindsight is 20/20, and now I'm left with memories that wake me up screaming and scars that ache when the weather turns cold. It was supposed to be a simple team-building weekend. Our marketing firm had been hemorrhaging clients, morale was at an all-time low, and our boss Janet Reed thought a camping trip would somehow fix everything. Janet was one of those relentlessly optimistic people who believed every problem could be solved with enough positive thinking and mandatory fun. She'd booked us a remote spot in Chase County, Kansas, far from cell towers and civilization, which she claimed would help us reconnect with nature and each other. The group consisted of myself, Janet, Kevin King from Accounts Receivable, and Sarah Rodriguez from Graphic Design. Kevin was a soft-spoken guy in his 40s who collected vintage postcards and had never spent a night outdoors in his life. Sarah was 26, tough as nails, and the only one among us who actually knew how to set up a tent properly. I fell somewhere in the middle. I'd done some car camping as a kid, but nothing like this deep wilderness experience Janet had planned. We drove out on a Friday afternoon in October, the prairie grass golden and swaying in endless waves under a gray sky that threatened rain. The Flint Hills stretched endlessly in all directions, broken only by the occasional copse of trees following some hidden creek bed. Janet had found this spot through some obscure camping app, a primitive site along Turkey Creek, miles from the nearest road and accessible only by a barely maintained dirt track. "Isn't this perfect?" Janet exclaimed as we parked next to a cluster of stunted oak trees. No distractions, no technology, just us and nature. The silence that greeted her enthusiasm was broken only by the constant whisper of wind through grass. Even in daylight, something felt wrong about the place. The trees seemed too twisted, their branches reaching at odd angles like arthritic fingers. The creek gurgled past our campsite with a sound that was almost like muffled voices. And despite the open prairie stretching to every horizon, I felt claustrophobic, as if invisible walls were pressing in around us. "My phone's got no signal," Kevin said, holding his device up like he was offering it to the sky. "That's the point," Janet replied, but I noticed she checked her own phone twice. We spent the afternoon setting up camp and exploring the immediate area. The trees followed the creek for maybe a quarter mile before petering out into pure grassland. There were signs that people had camped here before, fire rings made of blackened stones, bits of trash caught in the brush, but nothing recent. The isolation was profound and unsettling. As darkness fell, we gathered around our campfire to cook dinner. The flames danced and flickered normally at first, but as full night settled over us, something changed. The fire began to burn with an odd greenish tint that made our faces look corpse-like in its glow. When Kevin pointed it out, Janet insisted it was just the type of wood we were burning, but I'd never seen a fire burn that color before. "Anyone else hear that?" Sarah asked suddenly. We fell silent, listening. At first, there was only the wind and the creek, but gradually I became aware of something else. A low, rhythmic sound like heavy breathing or distant drumming. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, pulsing in time with my heartbeat. "Probably just some animal," I said, though I didn't believe it myself. The sound continued for hours, growing louder as the night deepened. None of us slept well. I kept checking my watch, but the hands seemed to move erratically, sometimes racing forward, sometimes crawling. When dawn finally came, it felt like we'd been trapped in darkness for days. Saturday dawned gray and oppressive. The breathing sound had stopped, but the silence that replaced it was somehow worse. Our food supplies, which had been fine the night before, were beginning to spoil. The bread was moldy, the apples had soft brown spots, and the milk smelled sour despite being well within its expiration date. "That's weird," Sarah said, poking at a package of lunch meat that had turned an unsettling gray color overnight. "Everything was fine yesterday." Janet, determined to salvage the trip, suggested we hike to a limestone outcropping she'd seen marked on her topographical map. It was about 3 miles northwest of our camp, following the creek bed partway before striking out across the prairie. The hike started normally enough, but within an hour, strange things began happening. Kevin's GPS device started giving contradictory readings, showing us in 3 different locations simultaneously. Janet's carefully planned route no longer matched the terrain we were crossing. Creeks appeared where none were marked on the map, and hills rose where the topography showed flat prairie. "I don't understand," Janet muttered, turning her map in circles. "This should be a simple walk." The limestone outcropping, when we finally found it, was nothing like what we'd expected. Instead of a gentle rise in the prairie, we discovered a jagged cliff face that seemed to loom impossibly high above us. Dark caves pocked its surface like empty eye sockets, and a smell drifted down from above. Something organic and rotten, like meat left too long in the sun. "Let's head back," Kevin said nervously. "This place gives me the creeps." But when we turned around, the landscape behind us had changed. The creek we'd followed was gone, replaced by an endless expanse of prairie grass that all looked identical. Our own footprints had vanished without a trace. "We're lost," Sarah said quietly. Janet refused to admit it, but after wandering for 2 hours without finding any familiar landmarks, even she had to acknowledge we had a problem. The sun, which should have been our guide, seemed to move erratically across the sky, sometimes appearing in 2 different positions at once. By the time we stumbled back to our campsite, purely by luck, it was nearly dark again. We were exhausted, dehydrated, and thoroughly shaken. Our gear looked different somehow, arranged in ways none of us remembered, and our fire ring was full of cold ashes, though we were certain we'd doused it completely before leaving. "Someone's been here," Kevin whispered. "That's impossible," Janet said, but her voice lacked conviction. "We're miles from anywhere." As we rebuilt the fire, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Mixed in with the ashes were what looked like small bones, too clean and white to be from any animal we might have cooked. When I pointed them out, Janet quickly scattered the ashes and declared them probably just sticks. The second night was worse than the first. The breathing sound returned, louder and more insistent, accompanied by new sounds, footsteps circling our camp just beyond the reach of firelight. The flames burned that same sickly green color, and now they seemed to pulse in rhythm with the unseen breathing. None of us spoke about it, but I could see the fear in everyone's eyes. Kevin sat hunched over his knees, rocking slightly. Sarah kept checking and rechecking our supplies, her hands shaking. Janet maintained her forced cheerfulness, but her smile had become a rictus grin that fooled no one. Around midnight, the footsteps stopped. The breathing ceased. Even the wind died away, leaving us in a silence so complete it felt oppressive. That's when we heard the voice. "Help me." It came from the darkness beyond our fire, weak and plaintive. A woman's voice, though distorted somehow, as if echoing from a great distance. "Help me, please, I'm lost." Janet started to get up, but Sarah grabbed her arm. "Don't," she hissed. "Someone's in trouble," Janet protested. "That's not a person," I said, though I couldn't explain how I knew. Something about the voice was wrong. Too hollow, too empty of genuine emotion despite the words of distress. The voice continued calling for another hour, sometimes closer, sometimes farther away, but always with that same artificial quality. Eventually it faded, replaced by a sound that was somehow worse. Laughter. Low, bubbling laughter that seemed to come from multiple throats at once. Dawn couldn't come fast enough. When it finally did, we found fresh tracks around our campsite. But they weren't human. They looked like a man's footprints at first glance, but the proportions were wrong. Too long, too narrow, with what looked like claw marks at the tips. They circled our camp dozens of times, coming within feet of where we'd slept. "We're leaving," Kevin announced, "right now. I don't care about team building or any of this. We're packing up and getting out of here." For once, Janet didn't argue. We broke camp quickly, stuffing gear into packs with trembling hands. But when we reached the spot where we'd parked the car, we found only empty prairie. The dirt track we'd driven in on had vanished as completely as if it had never existed. "This is impossible," Janet kept repeating. "Cars don't just disappear." We spent the entire day searching, following what we thought might be tire tracks or footpaths, but finding nothing. The landscape seemed to shift around us, familiar landmarks appearing and disappearing like mirages. The limestone cliff we'd found the day before was nowhere to be seen, despite walking in what should have been the right direction for hours. As the third night approached, we were forced to accept that we were truly stranded. We made camp in a grove of stunted trees near another section of creek, our food supplies now completely spoiled and our water running low. The creek water was brackish and foul-tasting, but it was all we had. That's when Sarah volunteered to look for firewood. "There are some dead branches about a quarter-mile upstream," she said. "I saw them when we were scouting for a campsite. I'll be back in 20 minutes. She disappeared into the gathering dusk, and we waited. 20 minutes came and went, then 30, then an hour. "We should look for her," Kevin said. "She told us to wait here," Janet replied, but her voice was shaky. When Sarah finally returned, the moon was high overhead. She walked into our firelight slowly, carrying an armload of wood, but something was wrong. Her movements were too fluid, too graceful. She held her head at an odd angle, and her eyes reflected the firelight like an animal's. "Sarah," I called out, "are you okay?" She turned toward me, and that's when I saw it. Her smile. It was too wide, stretching her lips in a way that looked painful. When she spoke, her voice had that same hollow quality as the woman who'd called for help the night before. "I'm fine," she said. "Never better." She dropped the wood beside our fire and sat down, but she didn't move like Sarah anymore. Her gestures were wrong, her posture unnatural. She kept that horrible smile fixed on her face, and I realized she hadn't blinked once since returning. "Where did you go?" Janet asked. We were worried. "Just collecting wood," Sarah replied, but the words came out flat and emotionless despite the smile. "Found some interesting things out there in the dark." Kevin and I exchanged glances. He'd noticed it too. Whatever had come back to us wearing Sarah's face wasn't Sarah anymore. The thing that looked like Sarah sat with us around the fire for the rest of the night, but it didn't speak again unless directly addressed. When it did answer questions, the responses were always just slightly wrong, using words Sarah wouldn't use, referencing things she'd never mentioned before. And always that smile, never wavering, never reaching its eyes. When dawn came, Kevin quietly pulled me aside. "That's not her," he whispered. "I know." "What do we do?" I didn't have an answer. The thing wearing Sarah's face watched us from across the dead fire, head tilted at that unnatural angle, still smiling. Janet, either unable or unwilling to see what we saw, continued trying to organize our rescue. She sent the Sarah thing to scout for water while she and Kevin worked on signal fires. That left me alone with my growing certainty that we were dealing with something far worse than just being lost. I'd heard stories about skinwalkers from a Navajo friend in college, shape-shifting entities that could take the form of anyone they killed, but always with some flaw that gave them away. The proportions would be slightly wrong, or they'd forget crucial details about the person they were mimicking. Looking at the thing that had taken Sarah's place, I was certain that's what we were dealing with. But how do you convince people of something so impossible? How do you tell your coworkers that their friend has been replaced by a monster from Native American folklore? The Sarah thing returned an hour later with news of fresh water, but when Kevin asked her about the graphic design project she'd been working on before the trip, something she'd been obsessed with for weeks, it just stared at him blankly. "I don't remember," it said, the terrible smile never wavering. That night, Kevin didn't come back from gathering firewood. We found his body the next morning about half a mile from camp, or what was left of it. Something had torn him apart with claws and teeth, scattering pieces across a 20-foot radius. His face was gone, along with most of his torso, but there was enough left to identify him by his wedding ring and the vintage postcard he always carried in his wallet. Janet vomited when she saw the remains. I just stared, trying to process the savage brutality of it. But the thing wearing Sarah's face showed no emotion at all, just kept smiling that empty smile. "Animals," it said in Sarah's voice. "Must have been a coyote pack." But I knew better. No coyote pack could have done this. And coyotes don't typically hunt in groups large enough to completely dismember a grown man. This was something else entirely, something with intelligence and purpose. That evening, as Janet and I huddled by our fire, the Kevin thing walked into our camp. It looked just like Kevin, down to his rumpled clothes and nervous mannerisms. But the eyes were wrong. Too bright, too aware, and constantly moving as if cataloging everything around them. When it spoke, it used Kevin's voice and speech patterns, but the content was all wrong. "Sorry, I'm late," it said. "Got turned around out there. This place really messes with your sense of direction." Janet broke down, sobbing with relief, rushing to embrace the thing that looked like her dead coworker. But I saw the way its hands moved when it hugged her back. Too long, joints bending in ways human fingers shouldn't bend. Now there were two of them. That night, while Janet slept between the two imposters, I lay awake planning my escape. Whatever these things were, they were patient. They seemed content to wait, to study us, to learn our behaviors and mannerisms. But I'd seen what happened to the real Kevin, and I had no doubt that Janet and I were next. The opportunity came just before dawn. Both creatures had settled into an unnatural stillness, sitting motionless by the dying fire with their eyes closed but somehow still alert. Janet was finally sleeping deeply, exhausted by days of stress and fear. I slipped out of my sleeping bag as quietly as possible and began creeping away from camp. The grassland stretched endlessly in all directions, but I had to try. Staying meant certain death. I'd made it maybe 50 yards when I heard Janet scream. The sound cut through the pre-dawn darkness like a blade, filled with such terror and agony that I almost turned back. Almost. But then I heard other sounds, wet, tearing noises and something that might have been laughter. Janet's screams cut off abruptly, replaced by an awful silence. I ran then, crashing through the tall grass without regard for stealth or direction. Behind me, I could hear pursuit. Not the heavy footfalls of human feet, but something lighter and faster, moving through the grass with predatory grace. The sun was rising by the time I reached the limestone cliff we'd found days earlier. In daylight it looked different, smaller, more normal, though the caves still yawned like hungry mouths. I scrambled up the rocky face looking for somewhere to hide, some defensible position where I could make a stand. That's when I saw them below, 3 figures walking across the prairie toward the cliff. From a distance, they looked like Janet, Kevin, and Sarah returning from a morning hike. But I knew better. I could see the wrongness in their movements, the unnatural way they held themselves. They found me, eventually, of course. There's only so high you can climb when you're running on adrenaline and terror. I made it to a narrow ledge about 30 feet up before the first one, the thing wearing Janet's face, started climbing after me. "Michael," it called in Janet's voice. "Come down, we need to talk." "Where are they?" I shouted back. "Where are the real Sarah and Kevin?" The thing paused in its climbing, tilting its head with that familiar, unnatural angle. "We are Sarah and Kevin, and Janet. We're your friends, Michael. We're here to help." But even as it spoke, I could see its true nature beginning to show through. Its limbs were too long, its movements too fluid. When it smiled, there were too many teeth, and they were the wrong shape, sharp and predatory. I had a knife in my pack, a simple camping blade that I'd barely used. As the thing reached for me with fingers that had grown into claws, I slashed at it desperately. The blade bit deep into what should have been flesh, but instead of blood, a thick, dark substance oozed from the wound, something that smelled like rotting meat and sulfur. The creature shrieked, a sound like nothing human or animal, and lost its grip on the rock face. It fell, landing with a wet thud on the stones below. But even as I watched, it began to rise again, its broken limbs bending back into shape with grinding, popping sounds. That's when I saw my chance. While the other two creatures were focused on their injured companion, I spotted something I'd missed before. A narrow crack in the cliff face, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. It led into one of the caves, but it was deep enough that I might be able to hide until they gave up looking for me. I squeezed into the crevice just as the injured creature started climbing again. The space was so narrow I had to turn sideways and exhale completely to fit through, triggering every claustrophobic fear I'd ever suppressed. But it was that, or face the things outside. The crack led to a small cave that stretched back into the limestone. I crawled deeper, using my phone's flashlight to navigate. The battery was nearly dead. It had been draining impossibly fast since we'd arrived, but it gave me enough light to see that the cave continued back into the cliff. And that's when I found them. The real Sarah, Kevin, and Janet were there, huddled together in the deepest part of the cave. But they weren't exactly alive anymore. Their eyes were open but unfocused, staring at nothing. Their bodies were pale and cold, drained of something essential. When I touched Sarah's hand, her fingers moved slightly, but she didn't respond to her name. They were still breathing, still technically alive, but it was clear that whatever made them who they were had been taken. The creatures outside weren't just wearing their faces. They'd somehow stolen their identities, leaving behind empty shells. I don't know how long I stayed in that cave. My phone died completely, leaving me in absolute darkness with 3 barely living corpses. I could hear the creatures outside sometimes, calling to me in the voices of my friends, promising help and safety. But I knew what they really were now. Eventually, the sounds stopped. Whether they'd given up or were just waiting, I couldn't tell. When I finally worked up the courage to crawl back to the entrance, the sun was setting again. The creatures were nowhere to be seen, but I didn't trust that they were gone. I waited until full darkness, then began making my way across the prairie. Without any landmarks or navigation tools, I had no choice but to pick a direction and hope. The grass was wet with dew that soaked through my clothes, and the temperature was dropping fast. I walked all night, stumbling through the endless grassland, jumping at every sound. When dawn came, I was exhausted and hypothermic, but I could see something in the distance, a dirt road cutting through the prairie like a brown scar. The road led to a highway, and the highway led to a gas station where a concerned clerk called the sheriff. I tried to tell them about the others, about what had happened, but how do you explain something so impossible? They found our original campsite eventually, along with our car. Apparently, it had been there the whole time, though I swear we'd searched that area dozens of times. They never found the bodies. The limestone cliff I described couldn't be located, despite several search parties combing the area. The official report listed my 3 co-workers as missing persons, presumed dead due to exposure or animal attack. I was treated for severe dehydration and exposure, then released into the care of a psychiatrist who specialized in trauma-induced delusions. But I know what I saw. I know what's still out there in the Flint Hills, wearing the faces of my friends, waiting for the next group of campers to wander into their territory. Sometimes I dream about them, about the things that took Sarah and Kevin and Janet. In the dreams, they're still smiling those horrible empty smiles, still calling my name in voices I once trusted. The insurance company paid out on the life insurance policies eventually. Their families held memorial services. I attended each one, staring at photos of people I'd once known while everyone talked about what wonderful, vibrant people they'd been. And all I could think about was how those same faces were somewhere out there in the Kansas prairie, attached to things that should never exist. I moved to Florida 6 months later, as far from Kansas as I could get while staying in the continental United States. I work remotely now, avoid company gatherings, and haven't been camping since. But sometimes, late at night when the wind is blowing through the palm trees outside my apartment, I hear something that sounds like breathing, something that sounds like footsteps circling my building. And sometimes I swear I hear Sarah's voice calling my name from the darkness, asking me to come outside, asking me to join them. But I've learned my lesson about answering voices in the dark. The last time I checked, there were new missing person reports from Chase County. Hikers and campers who went into the Flint Hills and never came back. The local authorities blame it on the harsh conditions, the easy way people can get lost in all that endless grassland. But I know better. I know what's really taking them. And someday, when I'm not strong enough to resist anymore, I think I know what voice will be calling to me from outside my door. The worst part isn't the fear, though. It's the doubt. Late at night, when the trauma feels like too much to bear, I sometimes wonder if the psychiatrist was right, if maybe I really did have a psychotic break brought on by getting lost in the wilderness, if maybe my friends really did die of exposure, and my mind created the monsters to cope with the guilt of being the only survivor. But then I remember the smile, that horrible, too wide smile that stretched Sarah's lips beyond what should have been possible. I remember the way the firelight reflected in eyes that didn't blink. I remember the sound of Kevin screaming in the night and the wet, tearing noises that followed. No psychotic break could create details that vivid, that consistent, that terrifyingly real. They're out there, in the Flint Hills, in the endless Kansas grassland, wearing familiar faces and speaking in trusted voices. Waiting for the next group of friends or family or coworkers looking for a nice weekend getaway. And if you're reading this, if you're thinking about camping in Chase County or anywhere else in that vast, empty prairie, don't. Find somewhere else to build your team spirit or reconnect with nature, somewhere with cell phone towers and park rangers and other people around. Because there are worse things than being lost in the wilderness. There are things that make sure you're never found at all.